Welcome to Real Life Fiction. I'm Matt James with Conundrum Publishing, international best-selling author of the Jack Riley Adventures. And today I'll be talking to author James Rosone. James, thanks for coming on the show. How you doing?
Doing outstanding yourself.
Doing great, doing great. You and I are actually enjoying a beautiful Florida winter.
We are. I mean, I almost had to put on pants today.
Yeah. That's my dad. My dad's from Michigan, so he put on a flannel a couple days ago, and I'm like, "Whoa!" It's
No,
like,
wow, cold. I know when I gotta wear actually wear some jeans and a pullover jacket or a sweater.
yeah,
I'm wearing a long sleeve, Stan. Come on.
yeah. I'm a jeans and t-shirt guy. I've always liked wearing blue jeans, and when I have to put on a second layer on top of the t-shirt, yeah, that's usually a sign that we're not in Florida anymore.
Well, and so people don't think I'm complete, weather wimp or anything like that. I
Yeah,
did grow up in born in the Chicago area, then lived in Wisconsin and kind of grew up
sure.
there. So I mean, I have done my share of the northern experience.
Yeah, and I've been here my whole life. I've been in South Florida my whole life. So for me, it's like it gets like 40s, 50s. I'm like, wow, this is great. This is just it's like ooh, you know. Any colder than that, like when we got into the 30s around Christmas, and then you're further north than me, so it got into the 20s, I think, up there. That's that's rough. Like West Palm Beach, where I am, we had the coldest winter in the last 20 years.
I know,
Around Christmas, and I'm like,
incredible.
yeah, and they're like, oh, and then of course inevitably you get some numbsime on Facebook. Oh, that's not a winter, and I'm like, shut up, man. When you grow
Don't
up in
mind
the
me. I've
heat,
got my Mike and Ike's that I like to sit and gnaw on
yeah,
from time to time, and I've got my caffeine right here. So
yeah, nice.
I'm ready to roll.
Mike and Ike is my single favorite candy. So
I can sit and keep those fly right all the time.
much respect, much respect. So for those that don't know you or are semi familiar with you, give us just a little bit of a rundown on who you are. Like, just kind of a little bit of your background. Who are you, James?
Good question. Sometimes I wonder that myself.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
and like I say, I was born and raised in the Chicago area and grew up in Wisconsin. And when my parents moved across the border, and so that's where all my family's from. It's where my cousins, my grandparents, my aunt and uncles, everyone kind of lives up in that region right now. Um, so just kind of a normal, average person, I suppose. I mean, when I was when I was growing up, believe it or not, I was actually homeschooled back before it was like cool. So we're talking 80s, early 90s, before we had widespread use of the internet and
hmm,
we connect with other homeschool families and know who all's around you. So it
yep,
was a different experience doing that. And uh, I don't know. I mean, I think it gave me a different perspective on life because generally speaking, I had other homeschool friends in my town where I was from, but I didn't experience a lot of the same things that I guess a lot of other people do with the elementary, junior high, and high school experience.
sure,
And I missed some of that. I will freely admit that. But at the same point, in a way, you just end up maturing faster. You just end up kind of, you know, you're around adults. You
yeah,
start to shadow and mirror your environment, and so it was kind of interesting like that. And moved into college and just followed life. I guess followed the same trajectory everyone else did. And it's ironic because here I am, 44, getting ready to turn 45 in April, and you look back on it and I'm not like my grandpa who worked for a company for 40 years, or
hmm,
my dad who's worked most of his places for 10, 15, 20 years, outside of the military. I, you just kind of move around a little bit. You go where the opportunities are and
yep,
where you can advance or whatnot. And you know, it's more prevalent to get laid off nowadays than it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, because corporations plus up and size down quite a bit.
yeah,
So it's kind of an interesting thing. But I got into writing by accident. It was never a design, wasn't my intent or purpose. Writing for me was therapy. When I got back from uh, the military from Iraq and transitioned to being a contractor, there was a period of time where you just go, go, go. And when you're in that environment, you don't really have a lot of time to process and think about what's you've been through, what's been going on. And I think it was when I left the government side in 2014, and then really kind of moved into more of the civilian sector, 2014, 2015. That's when things slow down, and that's when you start experiencing those time to think about what you've been involved in, what you've been doing, what you've been exposed to. And for me, that's when PTSD kind of really started to impact me and have a lot more problems. And thank God, someone at the VA introduced me to writing. They said, "Hey, we thought about writing therapy and writing." And I was like, "What do I know about writing? I'm horrible at English. I can't spell to save my life. I adverb, pronouns, stuff like that. I mean, my grammar skills are terrible. But you can hire an editor who's good at that stuff. It's all about the creativity of coming up with a story that people want to read, though. Yeah, and I was good at that, and that's
agreed. Yeah, no, I completely agree. Yeah,
it's just therapy for me. It's just because you just struggled. It's just I didn't know how to express myself. I didn't know what to say or what to do, and I had so much I just wanted to get out of my head and just on the paper, and just get it out of me, and be able to just write. And at the time, I wasn't even writing stories or books. It's just writing, just getting it all out of your head and getting it off your chest. Everything that you did, all the things you were angry about, or you were mad about, or disappointed on, or wish you'd done differently, or things had gone a different path, and you just were able to get that out. And then this counselor was like, "Well," I was having problems. Like, "Well, what should I write next? What should I keep doing?" Because it was I felt it was working, but I also felt I didn't want to keep rehashing things.
Sure.
And so she's like, "Well, you like to read a lot," and I did. I was a massive bookworm. And she said, well, why don't you write the kind of book you would want to read that you don't see out there? Because that should give you plenty of fodder to just sit and create for a while. And she's thinking, hey, I'm just going to send him on his way, and he's going to have this never-ending book report project. And little does she know, she kind of put a little fire and gave me a little bit of direction to push me into actually being a writer. And, I started creating the kind of book I wanted to read, the kind of book I couldn't find. And lo and behold, there ended up being quite a bit of a market for that. Yeah. And it started very slow, 1 or 3 books a week or something. And then it started to slowly pick up a little bit. And by the time we hit, I think, our 3rd book, and we ended up making, I think it was $5,000 or $6,000 in a month. That's when I started to realize, holy crap, this could become something more than just a hobby. This might actually become something legit. I might actually be able to become a writer, full-time writer.
Yeah.
And I was working full-time at the time, and I was working as a VP over at Aon in Chicago, doing cyber risk assessments and the insurance avenue. And eventually, I had to kind of make a decision. Do I want to stay pursuing that kind of a corporate world, or do I want to really dive into this writing? And that was a little bit of a struggle there because I was making good money. I mean, I was making $140 a year with Aon. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't chump change. Mm-hmm. And it was a good career progression to move up and continue moving up because once you hit certain career tracks, you could really excel and move up. And I already had the graduate degrees. So I've already got the education work done. But did I really want to give that up to be a writer, to take a chance on me, 100% on me and my ability to make this work?
Yeah, that's a lot to just walk away from.
Well, and I struggled with that. I couldn't separate. I couldn't walk away from. I couldn't take that chance like that. And then we had our quarterly reports came out for the business. They were spinning off. Part of it was getting sold off to BlackRock. And so when they sold Aon Hewitt to BlackRock, it took 30,000 employees, a few billion in revenue. And then it said, "Oh, by the way, we're going to let go of 2,000 vice presidents, senior vice presidents and directors, and just kind of trim down the company." And I was last in, so obviously I'm first out. Well, they made the decision for me, and I didn't have a choice in that. Yeah. And okay, well, I can find another job in the same career field and continue to try and advance to make that work, or I can say, you know what? I just published my 4th book. I'm doing a little okay. Why don't I go all in on this? Because if I'm willing to work, insane hours for these corporations, why can't I do it for myself?
Yeah. So
And
which books at this point are you writing as far as timeline wise? What is this this is before Monroe Doctrine started, right?
years before.
Years
Yeah.
before. Okay. Okay. Which what are you writing at this point as far as stylistically and genre? Like what is
No,
are
man,
you
I had a good idea. Fairy struck me back in, what was it? I think it was end of 2019. I was really burnt out on my Fallen Empire series. It
Mhm.
started out with Rigged, and it continued to move through there. We started writing that book in 2018, before the 2018 election, and having worked in my background and what was going on, I kind of, I saw um, how easy it is to manipulate elections, how we can use social media and do what's called a social social engineering that you can do with just posts and things like that on on social media. We've seen how that
Yeah.
stuff works. Well, there's a very big intelligence background how you can make that stuff work for your advantage, to condition a society to think one way, to go after something. And I wanted to write a series about how could we jack up the U.S. election? How could I make this thing work from an adversarial perspective? Because we would look at that and say, okay, if we want to change the government in Belarus and get rid of the guy currently there, how would we do it? And put a plan in. I said, okay, if I've been involved in putting that in other places, why can't I do that here? So we wrote a series on that. It was great, but it was very intense, and it did well monetarily wise, but we got a lot of backlash from people who just couldn't separate fiction from reality. And I needed a break. And that's when the Good Idea Fairy came and said, hey, why don't you write sci-fi for a little while and take
Yep.
a break from thrillers? Because I had the Monroe Doctrine already in my mind. I was going to run through it, do it. And so I kind of split. I said, let's do sci-fi and thrillers. And I've tortured myself for 2.5 years now, writing one book in each genre, every other book. And
Sure.
that has been mentally brutal. And
Yeah.
I'm excited to be finally winding one down and going back to focusing on one genre at a time, where I can just spit them out in good quality books all at one shot and not have to have this start, stop, start, stop, start, stop. That's mentally really tough.
Yeah, no, I know that firsthand. I know that firsthand. They're stylistically when they're different series, but as long as they're in the same roundabout genre, it's
Yeah.
easy. It's just
Yeah.
when you're really having to flip your genres around and the book styles change, the text different, the research is entirely different. It can really, really like grind you to a halt and go, oh man. So that's why I write a lot of action adventure or archaeological thrillers is what a lot of us call them now. We kind of coined the term in the last few years. And it's an easy genre for me to write, but it's also my favorite genre to write. So it's kind of a win-win because that's just where I want to write. So it's like I would love to get into like more of the space opera stuff that you've been doing, these sci-fi books. But man, I don't even know where to begin when it comes to the story building. Like that is so like I just can't comprehend basically creating a world from scratch.
Yeah, for me, what was really interesting is we create these amazing world with our military techno thrillers, and I think that's why people really enjoy what we've written in that realm, and we're very well known in that area. I mean, that's where bread and
Yep.
butter is still at. But my, for my perspective as a writer, one of the challenging things is I've spent years at this point, like crafting, creating this world, and now I've reached the natural conclusion of the conflict, and it has to end. And so, like when we wrote, our Red Storm series, which it started with Battlefield Ukraine, and then the whole global war just kind of unraveled and just happened. And when our characters get through the natural arc of going through this conflict over the years, it has to end.
Sure.
And once it has ended, that world has ended, so to speak, from a writer's perspective. And to just go and recreate it all over again with another scenario and everything else, it gets a little challenging. And it also comes a point where there's only so many conflicts that you can realistically play out without them being very repetitive. And so for me, I wanted sci-fi was a break from that, because inside of this Rise of the Republic world that we've created, um, it doesn't have to end. There's ways that this can really go on for a very long time, as long as you've got a good story arc to it. You've got a good path of what you're going to do with it. You can stay working in this thing for years, decades if you want to. And
Sure.
for me, there was a lot of appeal to that. And
Yeah.
so I've really enjoyed doing that. Um, my only gripe with any of it is that it's been very challenging to write both at the same time. Going forward, my strategy is I'm not going to walk away from sci-fi, because I do enjoy that. We've built a huge audience in a very short time. Is going to focus on one of them at a time, where when we finish the Monroe Doctrine, we have 2 more books left. They're going to be done over the summer. Then we're going to focus on finishing the final pieces of Rise of the Republic.
Gotcha.
And then as that finishes, we'll have a 1-year pre-order before we start the next arc of that series. But in that period, that's when we'll release the next thriller series. And then when the thriller series ends, there'll be another 1-year pre-order for that one. Before that, the next one will start. But in that period, we'll have another period of sci-fi books come out. So that way, it's a continuous rotating circle, so to speak. But we're able to focus on that one genre for an extended period of time, where we can really create a string of books together to satisfy the reader demand, and still move the story along and keep it moving as a business too.
No, yeah, and that's where I think a lot of people don't understand is it's a business. You have to write what sells.
It's like a product.
It's a product. Yeah, it is. It absolutely is. And thankfully, my best-selling books happen to be in the genre that I adore. So I'm not forced to write something that I'm not fully committed to. And it's great. And the strategy that I came up with, which seems to be working, is so like my Jack Riley series is Jack and then a lot of B characters, and then I return some characters just for relationships, and depending on what part of the world he's sent to investigate this relic or this ancient city.
With that, yeah.
Yeah, but what's cool is that each individual story is still its own standalone story. I don't recommend reading them out of order because of just character development, but the stories themselves don't overly link to the one before. So creatively, it's easy to just let go and then start over. I don't have to go, okay, where did I leave off to make this flow fluidly? And I've done that before. And I feel like sometimes I accidentally paint myself into a corner because I have to continue the story in a certain direction because I've had 4 books dictate where it's going. And I'm like, man, so when I started the Jack Riley series a few years ago, I told myself, I'm like, we're not doing that anymore. We're from the get-go, like in my head, I'm going, we are keeping these stories independent from one another just for creative purposes, because I can send him to different parts of the world and it doesn't matter where he was beforehand. And it's given me so much like relief, because I don't have to worry about like where, like right now, Jack is in the middle of the Pacific on this uncharted island in the book I'm currently editing, and the Venetian Pursuit, which actually, as we're recording this, should be out within the next month.
That's cool.
Yeah, and so, but when he's done here, he's going home, and when I write the next book, he'll go off somewhere else, and it's just where do we need Jack to go next? Compared to where he's been, because I don't want to keep beating that same. Like I've written about the Middle East because I love like Egypt and I love like the ancient stuff over there. So it's like there's certain parts of the world that I need to explore more because I've used the other ones so much.
There's so many neat places to go and explore.
Yeah.
Like most people don't know. Like if you really study and look at like the history of, say, like Armenia, right? That is such a fascinating country historically because like time really goes far back. Like Noah's Ark is on Mount Ararat, and right there opposite Yerevan, and some of the oldest known points in time are right there in Armenia. And there's a whole arc of just really unique history between Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Dagestan, and Chechnya, and that whole regional area there is very, very unique. And honestly, nobody knows much about it because it's never been a part of our history that we've kind of been interested in studying or looking at. But I didn't know a whole lot about it until I was working at U.S. European Command, and there was a project I started working on in Armenia for about a year and a half, and so I started learning a lot more about that. And when I visited Yerevan a few times and started talking with the locals there, and they started telling me more about their history and learning more about it, it was very unique and interesting. It's something I hadn't even thought about.
Yeah, and I guess when you really think about geographically, like you get Western Europe, you get the Middle East,
Mm-hmm.
and then you get the superpowers in Eastern Asia,
Mm-hmm.
and you're like everything in between kind of gets lost because there's so much like publicized history
Mm-hmm.
sandwiching it. And when you really think about it, all of those countries that make up the western border of, Russia and China and all of that area, even India and all of these more, I guess I just say publicized countries because I mean those are the ones we know for one
Mm-hmm.
reason or another. And then you get further west than that and you get all the European nations and the Middle East nations just because of news and just I guess more current events. And then you're just kind of like, well, that's the world we know. But there's so much in between
Yeah.
that is just unknown to a lot of us. And I mean, it's a disservice because, like you said, there's so much history there that deserves to be explored. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess it just takes people like you, people like me, to do it. And
Let's
to
find ways to weave them into your story, like
yeah,
weave them into the plot, weave them into there. Like we wrote Battlefield Ukraine in the summer of 2017, man. Not a lot of people knew squat about Ukraine.
no,
They just didn't know a whole lot about it. They didn't know about, the conflict happening in the Donbass. Like they see that the war's going on right now in Ukraine, but what they don't, nobody wants to acknowledge or realize is that war's been going on for 8 years between the Ukrainian government and Luhansk and Donetsk. They've been fighting that war for a very long time between each other, shelling each other back and forth, and just that conflict's been simmering a long time. It's not like it's just brand new. What is new is you have uniformed Russian soldiers in it. Because
sure.
before, the Russians were sending a lot of their people in as advisors and, helping them out in that respect, just as we were doing that in, say, Syria or Libya and in other places in the Middle East. It's just now it's war in the open, and it's really come to a full head and a complete clash where we're at now.
Yeah, no, and you're exactly right because a lot of the conflicts, unless you have family that's Ukrainian or Russian, a lot of or just in that particular area, not even just those two countries, it's kind of an unknown thing until all of a sudden Russia crosses the border and invades.
And nobody knows the real backstory, what actually
Yeah,
happened, why this whole war started. Everyone goes back to the Maidan Revolution, and Viktor Yanukovych was this Russian pawn, this Russian puppet, and things like that. Well, before they started saying all that about him, he was viewed as this pro-Western dude, or at least a semi-neutral dude, neutral guy. It all stems back in 2012 when you had the financial crisis just hammered the heck out of Europe, right? And then we had the German ECB. The Germans kind of controlled that thing in Europe because I was there from 2010 through first part of 2014. And when we had the financial crisis was really bad in a lot of the European countries, and then we had the Arab Spring take place in Tunisia and just kind of swept through the whole place. That just exasperated the problem. Greece, Portugal, a lot of these countries got really hard hit economically hard. The ECB came in, European Commission Bank, European Central Bank, they came in and they offered bailouts. These bailouts had very tough, austere requirements. And, it's why we saw the rioting in Greece and all the problems that were happening there. Well, Ukraine was in the same boat. They were desperate for funds. And the ECB came in, and I think it was in the spring, they started negotiations, spring of 13, negotiating and doing all that. And they got the same offer more or less that Greece was getting, hard austerity, a lot of reform. Ukraine is a corrupt as hell country, just always has been. Most Eastern European countries are, Bulgaria, all those countries like that. They're all really, it stems from that Soviet control, that communist era like that. There's just a lot of that corruption that just hasn't gotten rooted out.
sure.
But that's the genesis of this whole conflict, is the genesis of right there. Because the ECB just was going to stick it to the Ukrainians and say, this is how we're going to reform the country, bring them into the EU, and get this thing rolling. was through this package. And then Putin came in and said, well, hey, we'll offer you a bailout of whatever you need, and we're not going to make you have to do all these reforms and all this other stuff. Well, the leader looked at that and said, well, what's going to be the least impactful on my country? Was not going to hurt me the least. And he took the Russian offers. Now, maybe it was the wrong choice, but that choice set into motion a whole series of events that led to the Maidan. And then from there, that led to the Russians annexing Crimea, then setting up the Minsk agreements where, lo and behold, Angela Merkel says they were never going to honor this thing anyways. It was just to buy time to train the Ukrainians. And it's led us all the way to where we are now. And it's
Yeah, so one man that made the easy decision just kind of...
Like, you're like, I can see all this thing happening years in advance. That's why we wrote Battlefield Ukraine, because I saw how this whole thing would shake out like that. It's just sad that, as predictable as it was, we did nothing to stop it. I wish we could have.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's where the... how involved do we get? Do we leave it alone? Because... we have our own problems. It's just every country does. Regardless, we just happen to be the U.S. Yeah. So it's like, and that's where a lot of it's going now. Is it's just the resources that we're sending over there. Not very few people agree with, but at the same time, I also understand leaving it alone would also result in catastrophe over there. So you're kind of like. That's the rock in a hard place, right? Is
nobody wants to end it because we have a strategic aim and agenda that is not necessarily the same as the Ukrainians or the same as the Europeans. And we think long term. Okay, we're looking at this situation. We're looking at, well, what can we achieve and how can we transform things so in 20, 30 years we have the result we want. That may mean there's going to be some pain to get to certain benchmarks along the way. It's not an anti-American thing, or it's not a anti-Western thing to recognize that post World War II, the Americans kind of made a bargain. You're going to ally with us against the Soviets, and in exchange, we're going to protect the sea lanes and protect international trade and provide that whole thing. But you had to ally with us, and that's just kind of been the way it's ever been. And not as the internet has come on, as this and social media has made it accessible to trade digitally and globally, the demand for the American Navy to keep the lanes open is not quite as needed, because I could sell books. 30% of my sales are overseas. I don't need an American Navy to do that.
Yeah,
the online infrastructure is needed.
Yeah, and it's not even a manufacturing problem, because the books get printed overseas too. So it's like there's so much accessibility in those other countries.
Technology evolves. It's evolving.
Yeah.
Security it's changed the whole security picture and how everything works.
Yep.
And it's not the same as it was 30 years ago or 70 years ago when the the unipolar world was kind of built.
Yeah. No, completely. Yeah, no, you're right. You have more. You have more experience in this than me, and it's great. It's great hearing it from somebody that was on the ground and there behind the scenes while a lot of this was happening, and it's just a different perspective, because we get what the media feeds us, which everyone that has a pulse understands that it's being spun one way or the other, and but when you're there. And like my brother-in-law was in the Marines, and he was in Afghanistan, and he was there for a year and a half. And you get this picture of the Afghani people and the people in that area as these murderous villains, these terrorists, and these he goes, the locals around the base were some of the nicest people I've ever met, and they were some of the most and he goes, and they were some of the most appreciative people. They loved that we were there. They understood why we were there. But that's a part of the picture that never gets painted. Yeah. He goes, when we would walk and we would just be plain clothed, and because a lot of the time they didn't want us in fatigues just because of we would be targeted, possibly. He goes, we would just be taught, and he goes, everybody knew who we were. They knew why we were there, and they were thankful for it. He goes, we never had personal problems over there that weren't battle, not just off. I don't know how to describe it, but he goes, when we were just out and about, there was never any issue. He goes, we never got these dirty looks. We never got this. People were appreciative of it. And it was actually very refreshing while we were over there to remember that all of these people exist, regardless if the population doesn't know that.
Yeah, and it's sad how the whole situation gets manipulated and taken over by or hijacked from just a small group of people, you know. And it's like we go in with great intentions, and unfortunately, situations punch you in the face, and next thing you know, the good intentions are out the window, and now you're having to deal with the situation as is. I mean, when we went into Iraq, I mean, I was a diehard true believer going in, remove Saddam, go in and take all this stuff out and just set up a new, democratize the Middle East, whatever. I'm young and dumb and impressionable and just going forward and doing that. And I think over time, as I got older and, some of the revelations we saw with Edward Snowden, WikiLeaks type things, and just my own experience inside the intelligence community for a while, and just seeing what we were doing and how we were doing all that. And when you're inside it, like you're involved in it, you're implementing and doing different things and executing stuff, it's you're very focused on your mission set and what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. But you don't always see the whole picture. So I would see my set and and I knew how my piece of the puzzle worked and what it was doing and what it was accomplishing. I didn't always see what everyone else was doing. And that's by design. It's how you have compartmentalized programs and things like that. But at the same point, the technology we were using that was very good at, something called TTL, tag, track, and locate, for finding Islamic extremists and targeting and doing things like that. It's very good. Problem is, it also has a secondary effect in that it can be very good to be if you want to turn it against your own people. If you want to go from an exterior look and point it inward, and go after your own people, very effective, and can be used just as we use it for targeting Islamic extremists. Well, I can use the same apparatus, the same setup, same tactics and techniques to shape ideological and political dynamics in a county, a state, a region, a country, very easily. And that's kind of the double-edged sword with technology, and why they're talking about like AI. Okay, there's a million good things with AI. There's a hospital in New York that they've been testing with, basically feeding it all of the MRIs, X-rays, all the information associated with helping doctors find cancer. And they have gotten to the point where this AI could find cancer just months, if not years, in advance of when a doctor would typically find it or see it, because it knows what to look for, and it can use vast amounts of data.
Yeah, it's on a grander scale than a human mind could ever.
And that's brilliant, and that's a use of like AI where it's brilliant in helping us in extending life and being a good tool.
Yeah,
but
and then
can be used for nefarious purposes. And
it could become, if you remember the movie Eagle Eye.
Yeah, persons of interest.
Yeah.
I mean, that whole thing, big chunk of what I worked on in Europe was persons of interest, at least on the biometric identity intelligence side of it was.
Yeah.
And it's just, that stuff's here. This Home Monroe doctrine is about, predictive behavioral analysis, how AI at some point will be able to build social profiles of military commanders and political leaders, and be able to somewhat guide military commanders on the battlefield and what to do and how to do it. And we'll be able to war game that happening a million times in seconds to find the right way to make it work, to find the right attack path to make it succeed. That's not something we've been able to do in the past. We had to trust our gut and training experience and look at the map and say, I think if we go here, we're going to get success. Well, the AI can do all of that and map it a million different ways and find, well, you go here, but you deviate this spot right here and then hit that spot. It always works. And you take that data and the commander implements it. That's going to be a revolutionary change in military warfare and the way we fight.
Yeah. And it's just a matter of time until it's actually.
Yeah. And it's almost here. I mean, that kind of stuff is almost here. ChatGPT is pretty much, that's the gateway. Because, right now it's about feeding it. It's about learning. It's teaching itself. It's being fed right now. the next iteration after this one is the one that's going to be sick. It's super scary, and that's
Gotcha.
not far away because we're feeding the brain. We're providing the corpus that's going to learn from and grow from.
Yeah, and that's where, like I said, that's I guess the earliest iteration of this would be Skynet from Terminator, and then like I said, the movie I was talking about was Eagle Eye with Shia LaBeouf years ago,
Yeah, I remember that one.
and where the city runs itself through an AI, and it becomes self-aware, and it's through this military program, and Shia LaBeouf in the movie, his twin brother is the I guess the programmer or the whatever
Yeah,
his title is with the engineer or something, and he sees where it's going, and he is going to recommend shutting it down, and the AI doesn't want to be shut down, and because it understands existence,
yeah,
and here we are where it tries to take over and kill everybody. And that's basically where Skynet was in Terminator back in the 80s. It's the exact same thing where the AI can get to a certain point to where back then, right, it was science fiction.
yeah.
Now it's getting close to science fact, or it is science fact. And you're sitting here going, it's making our lives easier, but it's also making complacency, and it's making so it's kind of spooky. It's kind of spooky.
The week Donald Trump won the election in 2016, right? So I was at Oxford that week, and I was having dinner at Christ Church with a guy named Dr. David Upton. He was the head of the Oxford Research Center there. He died, ironically, he died a few years back, but he was sharing with me about a kind of a similar program that they were developing with the Met Police, and basically working on something called predictive behavioral analysis. That's where I got a lot of the ideas for the Monroe Doctrine, was actually from my conversations with him about that. And what they were doing with the Met Police is they're trying to figure out with smart policing, for instance, you don't want to have like a million cops in one geographical area that's a high crime area all the time, because it talks about oversaturation, militarization, all that other stuff like that. What you want to do is figure out, well, okay, where at what hours of the day do I need to have a greater police presence in different portions of the city? And what are some of the indicators that happen just prior to crimes occurring? And when you can really understand those kinds of pieces of information, you can know where to place police officers. You can know where to go and do that. And there was another incident where I don't remember the Olympics. I think it was around the Olympic times when they had the bunch of riots and things happened across the UK for a period of time. I think it was in 2012. There was a number of riots. I think it was 5 or 6 or 7 days where it was happening in London and a few other places. Well, because of all the CCT, cameras they had there, they had just millions of hours of footage of what happened. They were able to go back and say, well, this building that got vandalized. They went back and they found like the video of it happening, and then through facial recognition, who was actually involved in it.
Yep.
And then we were able to issue arrest warrants for the individuals that were involved in it months after the event happened, because they were able to go back and look at that.
Sure.
And that was a really unique way of being able to do kind of like smart policing. But here's a problem with, here's like how technology is evolving and creates a nightmare scenario for you, right? Deep fake technologies.
Yeah.
So I want to set you up.
Yeah,
and I
spooky.
create something. Like I digitally create you in the act of a crime that you didn't commit, but I have a digital evidence that deep fakes made. And how do you counter that? How do you counter that?
Yeah, there's a video recently of a younger white male with doing a deep fake of Morgan Freeman, and he does the voice, but his impersonation is like on point. And it's literally side by side of him talking and then the finished product talking.
Mm-hmm.
And you're just sitting here going,
Jesus.
yeah. And then the most famous of them all is the Tom Cruise one, right? Where, I mean, he looks identical anyways, but then the mannerisms, but then this, then that. I mean, side by side, you're like.
Oblivion, was that the movie Oblivion, I think it was? Where he's on a planet and he thinks he's doing these missions, but he doesn't realize he's like the 17th generation or iteration of it.
Oh yeah, that's yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, and I can't remember. Yeah,
what it's called.
Yeah, he's like alone. He's like alone on the planet, and Yeah. Oh yeah, no,
I'm blown
it's
when
an
that happens.
oh yeah, no. But so tell us a little bit about Rise of the Republic. Like where did that start? Like where does it begin? Where does kind of the I guess the overall arcing story kind of like I guess what is it? We'll just kind of
Yeah.
just keep it very
So
broad.
so basically, when I came up with that idea, I wanted to have something that was somewhat near term. I didn't want to go thousands or hundreds of years into the future. I wanted touch points of reality right here and right now.
Sure.
And so what I the premise basically is that there was a very large, I call it the AI war, that happens a number of years early, like the 2030s, late 2030s, early 2040s. So it's a little vague on the timeline. And that was by design. But
Yeah.
this happens there. And in the aftermath of that, a lot of the nations end up getting quite devastated from this war because we start using, surrogates, like human bot, like war bots, kind of that kind of a concept, right?
Hmm.
So you've ever seen that movie with Bruce Willis where you have it's called Surrogates, and you have
Oh
these
yeah.
things and things like that, and then you have Will Smith and iRobot, kind of a
Yep.
mesh of those kinds of things. So instead of having a human operating, a Reaper drone over Ukraine and zapping a tank with a Hellfire. Well, now you have a human operator in a VR set, kind of like the metaverse, and he's sitting there using a surrogate body in combat. And when he gets blown up, he just goes to another body and just grabs another trooper and goes right back in the fight. That's the future of warfare. That's where we're heading. It's just a matter of how soon are we going to get there and who's going to get there first, us or the Chinese first. And whoever does, probably going to win. And this devastates the country. Well, as a consequence, you have a consolidation happen. So in our case, we have the Republic. The United States kind of goes by the way of the dodo bird, but it keeps a lot of it. Some of it still sticks around as far as beliefs. But you form the Republic. Then we had the Greater European Union, which encompasses Russia and old Europe and parts of the Middle East and North Africa. And then you had what is it? We call it the Asian Alliance, which just kind of morphed and took in a lot of India and China and Japan and the Koreas and morphed a lot of Asia. So we had three main power blocks. And the Republic is North America and most of Central and South America. And then you had some of the other English-speaking countries, Australia and the UK, kind of merged together to form the Republic, so to speak. And they basically developed what we called at the time called the SET, the Space Exploration Treaty, where we said, we can't do this again, that nearly wiped humanity out. Let's create a treaty where we're going to share technologies and collaborate together in going to the stars, something that's relatively apolitical that we can all come together around and focus on. And they move forward. And so each block ended up developing a critical piece of technology, whether it's faster than light technology like neural implants or artificial gravity, that really kind of made space travel work. Because you got to have some kind of technological advancement to make the whole story work, so to speak.
Sure.
We did that. So that kind of happens in like 2070 is the prelude to the whole book. Prelude chapter is these evolutions happen in 2070. Now 2090 is chapter 1, where everything starts. And we're currently up to, I think the timeline now, I think it's 2116. So we're not terribly far forward yet, but that's where we started. That was the genesis. And when we originally put together this expedition that's going to go to Alpha Centauri. All three alliances are going to go together, and we're going to colonize our first world and do that. And then, lo and behold, the NRO, which is the National Reconnaissance Office, we brought them forward, finds a planet, and send a bunch of probes out. They find another planet that's same distance-wise as Alpha Centauri, but we're like, hey, we don't want to share this. So we're going to let the tree expire when it's supposed to expire and go our own way, right? And do our own thing. But that's when we run into trouble. So that's when we land there. And then as we're going there, one of the big reasons we go there is because we see, when we're looking at all the maps and the visuals of the planet, we zero in and see, get down there and look at like the mountain area, I think is where we talked about. They found a cave. They started finding some cave entrances, and they started finding some what looked like tools. And that led them to believe that, hey, there might actually be some life down there. Let's go check this out. So we let the treaty expire, we deviate, and we go our own way. But that's when we encounter what we end up encountering, which is our first alien species. And we're not totally sure how the hell this happened, but what appeared to be subjugated humans on that planet working those mines.
Interesting.
And comes the whole mystery of how the hell does that happen?
Yep.
What happened with this? And who the hell are those aliens? And opening Pandora's box. And then from there, it's just kind of the whole story continues to unfold and move out. It's kind of a unique way of looking at it. A lot of touch
definitely.
Modern society. I have basically, we move away from like SpaceX or things like that. We move into like, I just coined it and just call them Musk Industries because, he's pioneering space. He's going to be the dominant force in space in the near term. And because our timeline is, starts at 2070 and then really goes forward at 2090, that's not that far off.
No.
You're talking less than 70 years. I got to think that SpaceX will still be around or a very
I don't see it going anywhere anytime soon with the quick success they've had.
Yeah, I have Blue. To be fair, I also have Blue Origin up there. And they're the competing enterprises, but that's what allows us to really grow and expand rapidly into becoming a interplanetary and then an interstellar society. Is because
spacefaring people versus oceanfaring. Yeah. Yep.
It's fun to explore. It's neat to look at. I don't want to say it's like you're not trying to rip off other type of series or other types of movies and different things like that, because there's only so many ways that things can be done.
Yeah.
But you have a lot of touch points. So you are going to have a separate belt society of groups of people who are going to live out in the asteroid belt area and mine the heck out of that, and in turn sell those resources back to the shipbuilders and everyone that's around Earth. That's just going to happen. So you end up with elements where you have something kind of like what you see with The Expanse. You also are going to have elements of, again, where you can roll in like parts of Battlestar Galactica where you have these Cylons. Before the war, you had the Cylons. They were human workers essentially, right? Mm-hmm. We're already headed that direction right now, where we're going to have, what Elon Musk is talking about, Optimus. Where it's a humanoid worker that's going to fill in the gap for the lack of workers that we are experiencing right now in the workforce. So when you think about it, if we want to build spaceships, why would we try to put thousands of workers or hundreds of workers in space when we can get really good at manufacturing humanoid workers and shove them in space? Because they don't need oxygen. They don't have to take a bio break or eat food. All you got to do is make sure you're changing out their batteries and keeping them powered up, and they're going to continue to work. They can do your welding. They can wire your things together, and you teach them to do more and more intricate work. But the point is, if you have a few hundred or a few thousand of these humanoid workers building your starships, building your space stations, they're going to get it done a hell of a lot faster, more efficient, and more precise than human workers will, just by default. And so we kind of really expand and built that out, like how I think it would be done.
Yeah, just look at like the auto industry, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the auto industry that's automated. I mean, you have humans, but it's automated. It's not like it used to be back, Henry Ford was building the Model Ts and that kind of stuff. It's all automated, and there's a reason. It's because it's more efficient. It's in the long term cheaper. Obviously, getting that stuff set up is just, I can't even imagine what kind of expense that is out of pocket. But it's inevitable, and that's just kind of, and that's AI, right? It's inevitable. It's just one of those things where I know a lot of people that are against it because they're talking jobs, they're talking workers. You start getting into more of this AI stuff, automated stuff, kind of like. So where did it first hit us recently was self-checkout, right? You go to Target, you go to any major retailer, any grocery store. I mean, CVS, everybody has them now, self-checkout. Mm-hmm. So people are like, well, you're going to be removing people, so you're going to be losing jobs. But then the other side of the argument is, well, you're actually going to create more jobs because now we have to build the technology. And it's like, it's kind of one of those situations where it's like, I think it's just going to like stalemate and stall out. I don't think it's going to be one versus the other. It's just going to be kind of the next generation. You're going to have more manufacturing jobs because the new technology needs manufacturing jobs.
Well, look at the other part too, is you also need to have skilled labor.
Yeah.
You've got to have plumbers. You've got to have pipe fitters. You've got to have electricians. You got to have some of these physical type jobs are very much needed. There's not enough people going into those trades. Those jobs
Yeah.
pay really freaking good.
Hmm.
They're only going to expand. And for a long time, that's not a job that is probably going to get automated away, or when they create,
Yeah.
I call them surrogates or synthetic humanoids. When those start to get created and built, that's not the first job you're going to put them in.
True.
You're going to be putting those into more of your high risk, high danger type jobs first, or very precise jobs. And then only when those have become like fully filled are they going to start to expand into some of the other types of positions.
Yeah, it's
So
where you start getting into like the iRobot stuff. So
correct,
yeah, you
correct.
start getting into that kind of stuff, and that was smartly done, that movie, as far as the tea leaves that were being sprinkled from start to finish. So no, that's so cool. It's cool, but it's terrifying at the same time, but I think that's just kind of
Yeah. Well,
just it is what it is.
and a writer too.
Yeah,
There's always a little bit of, I don't want to say like the magic, whatever, but first there has to be a little bit of imagination to it.
yeah,
But you also want to make sure that you're tethering it to reality and
yep,
saying, maybe this is not available to do right, today. Could it be available in 3 years or 10 years or 20 years from now? Possible, or maybe very likely. And so that's how, when I design, when I talk about like drones, or I talk about future warfare or different things, whether it's in the Monroe Doctrine or in the sci-fi, everything I try to do is I try to tether it to whether it's actually real, like whether it can actually happen. And that's why I have these synthetic humanoids. We call them synths in the book. We have our like civilian versions where they're broken to 4 core functions, societal type functions that they do. And then at some point, because we're fighting these alien adversaries in our series, they're 10-foot tall, big blue ugly bastards, and they've got 4 functional arms. We needed some help. And as good as our military is, we needed some help. And that's when we kind of reluctantly brought back we didn't go back to surrogates, but we went the next evolution forward, where we actually used synthetic warriors.
interesting. So it's kind of like the next evolution of where like Alien, right, with the Alien series with their synthetic
Yeah.
surrogates and stuff. Yeah,
Well, yeah. And so our guys, we bring them in, and
yeah,
they're actual, like, they're there for war. They're
sure,
they're built
yeah,
for war.
yeah. They're built for war. Yeah, those were science, I think, in scientists and stuff. In like, yeah, okay,
Yeah, and
yeah,
there's obviously reluctance in using them because of the historical presence of what happened to us the last time we used them.
yeah.
We're nervous about that, so we integrate them, but we integrate them in slow. And what we do is we actually start integrating them in and fielding them in as like augmented help with special forces. And
Okay.
as they are able to learn and teach and build out the parameters of how to effectively use them, they start to grow and expand. And it helps us because a lot of writers fail to do, or they don't, or they gloss over, okay, is logistics. Logistics wins real wars. Okay, the war in Ukraine will be won on logistics. Who can supply bullets to their side, consistently and often, is going to win. And in space, just like in real world, you have to account for that. You have to supply with food, fuel, water, munitions, and keep that rolling. Well, if you're going to move forces from Earth to another planet, space becomes a problem.
Yeah.
Physical, actual space
It's
for a ship. How many people?
yeah, shipping lines, just like here in the U.S. or here in the
Exactly.
planet.
You've
The
got
planet,
to
yeah.
pack people onto a ship and move them. And in the time, we have FTL, drives, so we can move fairly quick. I think we settle on basically 1 light year, 1 day, more or less simplified it. But you still have distance that has to be traveled, and you have to feed people, and you have equipment that has to be brought with it. So this is where like synthetic humanoids are synths. Right? We call it their C100s, model number C100, and then we have another iteration of C300 and so on. Those guys don't need food. Okay, they don't have biological functions, so you could pack them in like sardines, and then it's about carrying them and their weapons and moving them forward. So a ship that would carry a regiment of 1,500 soldiers. Well, that ship carrying 1,500 could probably carry 10,000 synthetics, and that's a big difference. And I love that part of the series because we really do dive into the logistical challenges of waging an interstellar war, having fleet support ships, supply lines, and moving things forward in convoys, and being able to keep all the commerce of it all actually going too, supporting the industry and keeping things running and warships being built and munitions and everything else supplied.
Yeah, it's the battle along the way. It's the battle before you get to the battle. It's, because it's inevitable. You're going to have pirates. You're going to have people trying to stop that. It's more than just A to B and then B is where the war is. It's all of the stuff between A and B that really matters just as much as the conflict does.
People find that fascinating. I mean, people love learning about those things. They love thinking about that. Like, how would I move 10,000 troops from this planet to this planet and along with everything you need? Well, that's kind of cool to actually write that out and have the mundaneness of the soldiers, just bored out of their gourds, trapped on this ship for however many weeks or months it is to get there, and then feeding them all. And what do you do for that? And keeping everything supplied. And you got guys on a cargo ship. They're doing all kinds of fun, silly stuff because they're bored.
Sure.
Hell, that's life. That's real, though. That's real.
Yeah.
You're in Iraq, or you're in combat. It's like 9% boredom and like 2% sheer terror. That's just how it is.
Yeah, that was again, my brother-in-law when he was in Afghanistan. He goes, we worked out and we ate and we slept. And he goes, it was like, I came home 25 pounds heavier, rock solid, because there was not a lot else to do. And it was like a common thing that we could all do together, and, like team building and that kind of stuff. And we were also just bored out of our minds when we weren't working. So, but that part of it is interesting because, like, I started doing that too in my books where, when I first started writing, 7, 8 years ago, and I was putting my stories together, I always kind of had this like idea where, it's been long enough to where I don't really remember where the influence for this idea was, because I seriously doubt I came up with it on my own, just being a novice at the time, was my books. Would I rather have a 100,000 word book, or would I rather have an 80, 70,000 word book, but every word be tight and perfect and matter? And I was always the tight guy. I was always like, I want everything to be like perfect from start to finish. I want the flow of the story. I want this, I want that. I was like pickier, I guess, putting the stories together. But as time has gone by, and as I've become more of the researcher, not necessarily the outliner, but more of the researcher, there's so much cool stuff that I learn about these areas, specifically with my action adventure stuff, because it's world travel.
Yep.
I want to tell people, I want to show people this kind of, I want to showcase the area. Yeah. So like, I made a conscious decision a few years ago to add back more fat to the story that really had nothing to do with the plot.
But people probably like it.
And the last few years have been my most well-received books.
Yeah.
And I realized, like, in The Undying Kingdom, for instance, Jack Riley 4, he's in Nepal, he's in Tibet, he's in these beautiful landscapes that I'll never go to probably, but, these areas where I'm like, I want to showcase these areas because I find them interesting just as like an average human being. While I'm also a reader, I have to give the reader what I think's interesting too, because I can't be the only one that thinks this stuff is cool. Mm-hmm. And there's parts of the book that is literally them driving through the mountains, just in the scenery kind of takes over. Mm-hmm. Or they stop to go to the bathroom and they get a coffee and he's like, man, I'm hungry. And then I'm looking up Nepalese breakfast or Nepali breakfast. I don't know what they eat. It's not bacon and eggs. So it's like, I just thought that was kind of cool to kind of start putting.
It's authentic.
Yeah, it does. It does. And that's the war between A and B we were talking about. It's like, I want to know what happens to their shipping containers. I want to know what happens to the crew. I want to know what happens like in between all that stuff, because it's easy. And I guess it's more like movie cinematic where it's just start to finish because you only have so much time. Mm-hmm. Where in the book, who cares about time? I mean, that's the whole reason we're doing books, is because it's dense, it's involved. And ever since I've been doing that, it's made the books bigger, but to me, it's giving the audience that deeper look into the universe that I'm trying to create.
Yeah, and a lot of my books, I don't write small books. Most of
Yeah,
my books tend to be 110,000, would almost kind of be a short book for me. Most of them
sure.
are 130 up to 145. So they're very big books.
Yeah,
But it allows you to really develop a really good story arc like that. But in doing that, a good story still has. There's a really good book called The Bestseller Code, written by Matt Jocker and Jody Archer. So inside there, they talk about how a book is kind of like an EKG, where you have your positives, your negatives, your positives, your negatives. It goes up and down, up and down, up and down like that. And that's what you want to do with the reader. You want to draw that first paragraph, the first sentence, the first paragraph has to pull them in.
yep,
And then you kind of string them through. And then that last paragraph or last two paragraphs has to make them go, wow, what's going to happen next? So they turn the page or they swipe. And when you develop that, where the beginning's like that, the end's like that, they can't stop.
yeah. It's
And
the hook and the cliffhanger. Yeah,
yeah, but in doing that though, there's a pattern for it. So what you do is you have like action, dialogue, action, dialogue. Now you can mix and have, say, two action sequences together or two dialogue sequences together. But what will kill your book every time is if you've got like 6 or 7 dialogue scenes before you ever get to action. You just lost the reader. They won't give you that much attention to get into the book. And on the converse side, if it's just like 10 sections of action, you've given them no breath. You haven't built the story, the arc of why it's so much action.
yeah,
So you find that balance where there's, the immediate action to grab them and hook them initially. And then you use those dialogue pieces to go in and explain and fill in those story things and help move it along. And it's almost like, it's kind of like a ladder or an EKG where it's a ladder that you're going up, you're moving through it, or the ups and downs. And that's how you built that emotional roller coaster. That's how you have the fast paces, the pulling them in, moving them around, and keeping them going like that. That's
yeah.
how you get the readers. You say, I bought the book. I didn't get to bed till 3 a.m. I got to get up in 2 hours to go to work.
Yeah, and I think I had, I think it may have been Kane Gilmore, who works closely with Jeremy Robinson. He does all his editing. He does a lot of his website design. He does a lot of very, very good friend of his, a great writer in his own right. I remember he was looking at my early work. So before I was a writer, I did beta and arc reading for Jeremy. That's how I kind of got into the business, was I was just a fan. And then kind of got the behind the scenes on how you're putting books together and like the writing process, and realizing that this might be something I could do. But I remember he always said was if you can describe a scene through dialogue versus just straight up narrative, always choose the dialogue, because all that's going to do is just bring in more of the character's personality. And that's why we read these books, is because of the characters. We fall in love with that character in general, because a lot of the time you get into these books and it's just all exposition and it's all narrative and it's all this, and you're just like, dialogue, and then all this and you're just like, just rewrite it and do it with dialogue, so that the character's emotion and it makes it more real.
What is the character thinking?
Well, because in real life, it's the human brain processing all of this, which is then the narration of the book. So just have it as just have it as the dialogue, or have it as the character's inner monologue, and bring in a little bit more of that style of storytelling. And ever since I started doing that, or ever since I learned that, I was just like, man, it makes so much more sense, because when you're reading and it's your favorite character in the book telling you what's happening versus just this ominous voice, it reads completely different, and it comes out differently. And even though it's the same exact like words a lot of the time, it's just the way it's portrayed is completely and utterly different. You believe it more because it's a character you love and trust. And it's just something that I've always kind of, so it's like same thing when you're doing the action and the dialogue. I love doing dialogue within the action sequences where they're like yelling at each other because it's just too loud and there's chaos going on, but they're still trying to communicate with one another. Even though it's a hectic scene, it's more relatable if they're trying to figure it out, and like, instead of just flat out action for 4 pages, and I again, I completely agree with you, and it's just it matters big time when it's just storytelling in general. But
Yep.
so when it comes to writing and comes to books and stuff, I'm like, obviously I know one of your big influences is your background in the military. But other than that, as far as a writer is concerned, when it comes to like entertainment, like I always tell people, I'm a movie guy. So I just grew up idolizing Indiana Jones, and then later with Uncharted and Tomb Raider, and I've just always been fascinated with history. History was always my favorite classes in school. I don't, and I'm not a guy that likes to travel very much, so it's probably because of that. I just think it's so fascinating with all this cool, just global history. Like where does a lot of this draw from for you as far as like influence, whether it's the genre or whether it's just the
Sure.
story in general?
Yeah. So growing up, I really liked like the History Channel. For me, was just amazing. I loved watching the History Channel.
I love
How they
Discovery
yeah,
Channel growing
Discovery,
up.
like
Same,
how
yes,
they
yeah,
build those, all those things. That were just
yep,
fascinating, seeing all that, and just how does it happen? And so for me, I loved being able to. Yeah, I love that part of history and reading the Civil War, reading about World War II. Um, Talking to my grandparents, my grandpas who fought in the different wars and learning from them. And then when I was in college, I went on ahead and I did a couple of study abroad trips. They were expensive, but I a student loan, and I pursued and did some of those things. So I did a winter semester in Ghana, West Africa. And so we went to Ghana and Burkina Faso and got to see that. I did a summer semester where we were in Nice, France, and then Florence, Italy, and just that northern Greece there. And then I did a fall semester in Munich, Germany. And for me, that kind of got like a little bit of travel bug. Because now I was in the countries I was reading about or studying, learning about, and just being able to associate a lot more of that together. And it's a fascination for learning. It's never
yeah,
wanting to be satisfied with what you know. It's always about asking the next question. But it's also about being willing to be open to other cultures and other ideas and other beliefs that may not coincide with your own.
hmm,
Um, as Americans, we're very cocky and arrogant. We think we know everything because the world revolves around America. It just does. Well,
it
that's
does.
the
Yeah,
thing. When you leave America, you find out that's not necessarily true.
yeah,
There are other countries, there are other cultures, there are other languages and foods and religions, and they all are very unique in their own right. And when you're able to like immerse yourself in that and become part of that and see that and feel and experience that, it just broadens your own ability to accept and be around that. It helps you better understand your own beliefs and reinforces your own beliefs, but it also makes you more open to being accepting of others and seeing theirs because you've been in there. You have a better
yeah.
reference. You see that they aren't all that different than me. They just grew up different.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people's problems, and I used to be this way too, was when you really look at just geographically, you have Europe,
Mhm.
but there's no states in Europe. There's countries within Europe. The U.S. is a country, but we have 50 states. So
Mhm.
if you look at each individual country within Europe as Europe's states, and then you look at the U.S. as a country, but then you look at our states, and you realize every state has its own culture and customs in the U.S. It's the South versus the North versus the
All
West
has
versus
something that unifies us. Like
exactly. So
I
when you
love
really think
California.
about it, yeah,
Yeah, someone who grew up in California, they listened to the same music I did in Wisconsin
hmm,
or in Florida. We watched the same TV shows, the
yep,
same movies. We have the same foods, the same fast food joints, the
yep,
same restaurants. It's a huge country, lots of different states. They all have different beliefs and different, there are unique things different about them all.
hmm,
But we always have these very common threads that tie us together.
yep,
And that's not what they have in Europe. Because while two people could be the same age, go through the same experiences, one in France, one in Germany, they're not the same.
no,
They
they're not.
don't have the same restaurant chains. They don't listen to the same music. They
Yeah.
don't they don't watch the same type of movies, read the same types of books.
Yeah, and that's where I think people get trapped with that is because they just assume it works the same as it does here, and it's
Nothing.
completely different.
Because they've all, it's like the European Union is this big social construct they tried to make. The problem is they never, there's no, it's everyone wanted to be like America without giving up their sovereignty. and they
Sure.
cannot until they are willing to say, okay, Germany, you're not in control. The voter in Greece has the same amount of power as the voter in Germany. You have national elections, you elect a national leader. There's no more national borders. There's no national internet. There's no more laws. They're only to one country and not to this country. It's all the same to a federalist society like that. You're never going to make it work.
And that's where history, because again, we are in, you know, 270, 280 years of existence. The other countries have been around for thousands of years, or at least at least their borders have. And you're sitting here going, you gotta understand that we are a baby when it comes to our individual sovereignty. Mm-hmm. We are a tiny little baby in the womb of history, and you have to really understand where, like Germany, they see their history all the way back, and you see Italy, and you see, yeah, and you're like, well, why can't they give it up? I'm like, we don't want to give up our local stuff, let alone our national stuff. Can you imagine if you're asking a country that's been planted for as long as they've had, that have had those traditional beliefs for as long as they've had, to just give them away overnight? It ain't gonna fly, and that's the thing. That could just be simple as pride. I mean, they don't want to give up who they are.
And that's the problem they're facing right now. You have this issue where, like Hungary is a great case in point, and Hungary and Poland actually it's kind of the same issue right now. So these are two Eastern European countries. They're both very religious, and the problem is Europe is pretty much an atheistic society, and you have Eastern Europe is not. They're either Catholic, or they're part of the Greek Orthodox, or Russian Orthodox Church. They're part of the Orthodox, or they're Catholic. Well, the rest of Europe is pretty much, there's no God. That's kind of their mentality at this point. And so there are a series of conflicts, like social conflicts, right? Well, these more religious groups don't want to accept, they don't want to change their laws to say, okay, well, gay people can get married, and people can become transgender and do all stuff like that. To them, that doesn't compute, because that doesn't coincide with their religious beliefs and in what they hold and what they believe is true. Now, in Europe, where they don't have that religious background, that foundational thing that ties them together, at least not anymore, they don't go to church. Church attendance is very low. Their religiousness is very low. And they don't have that same social tie that these other countries do. And those countries deepened those ties when the Soviet Union fell, because communism really clamped down on it. It didn't make it very hard. So what happened when that went away? They didn't have to be godless communists anymore. They could now embrace what they've always wanted, and they did. I don't want to say extreme, but they did.
They made up for lost time.
But now you have a clash. You have a clash. In Hungary, they're basically trying to hold a lot of their EU funds hostage, saying, well, if you don't pass these laws that bend to what the rest of the EU does, then we're going to not give you your money. And Hungary's like, well, this is our culture, and this is what we believe, and this is what our people here want. It's not that we're against anything. It's just this is what our people want, not what the people in Brussels want. You're in Brussels, that's fine for Brussels. What's good for Brussels is not good for Bucharest or Budapest. Mm-hmm. What's good for Budapest is not good for Brussels, and that's fine. But it's fine until suddenly it's not. And that's the problem they're in right now. And the only reason EU is not issuing problems with Poland is because, Poland is all in on Ukraine, and poor Hungary is completely landlocked, has no ports, and is totally dependent on a Russian pipeline. So what are they going to do? They're not going to cross the Russians. They don't want their whole country to get turned off.
Yeah, and that's, and think about the U.S. and it's the same aspect, right? Like Florida is Florida, and Florida is successful. It barely shut down. DeSantis kept us open. They kept us breathing. Other countries decided to lock down, and it utterly destroyed other states they're utterly destroyed because of it. Oh, they're devastated. And that's almost like over there, but over there is to the 10th degree. It's to the umpteenth degree, where what we're dealing with is local issues. They're dealing with is like ancient issues, and that's, our traditions are our traditions, but they come from other people's traditions, from our forefathers and that. Their traditions are like, that's what I think people really need to understand, is when there's a conflict over there and it doesn't make sense to us, you have to take us out of the equation and realize you can't look at us because we're so young. You got to look at some of these countries that have been the way they've been for hundreds and hundreds, multiple, 7, 8, 9, 10 centuries. And you're sitting here going, if they don't want to change what they're doing,
Yeah.
you have to understand where they're coming from. We don't want to change what we're doing. And some of the states in our country haven't been states for all that long. So it's like, when you really think like Western expansion and you think, the 49ers and people running west, it's like a lot of those states are very, very like ridiculously young when you
Look at
think.
Hawaii hasn't exactly been a state for very long.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you're talking about a country like Germany or Poland or Armenia, any of those countries. And even if they were territories or they were, like Ukraine was, they've been there for so long.
You look at Ukraine, and geographically parts of Ukraine were part of Poland. Another part was actually part of Hungary, and Moldova's part was part of there. And then you had other part of Ukraine was actually historically part of Russia. And it's all piecemeal. It's all stitched together.
Yeah, that's like Alsace, Alsace between France and Germany. And they're like, well, what country does it belong to this decade? And it's like, they've flip-flopped so much between, And that's why when I was at Total Wine for 5 years and you're realizing, well, isn't Alsace part of France? And they're like, now. But a few decades ago, it was German, and before that, it was France, and before that, it was German. And they're like, that's why they make German-style wines in France. And they're just like, because when wine production was first getting going there, it was a German area. And then I'm like, when you're like, oh, okay. Geographically, when you start to really pull in the history of it all, things start to make a little bit more sense. And we just don't have that here. And that's where our perspective is very limited as far as the average American. You traveling abroad and you seeing all this stuff, people that grew up abroad and then have settled here, their perspective is different. I live vicariously through all that. I try not to have a super like concrete opinion on things happening overseas, just because I don't have the frame of reference to make an educated. I see something, I don't like it. Okay, I don't like it, but I don't understand
why
I don't like it. I just see conflict. I don't like conflict. War sucks. I don't want to see any of it. And I'm sitting here going, I don't want Ukraine to get taken over by Russia. I don't want to see all this. I don't want to see all that. And then you sit here and go, but Ukraine is not the choir boy that a lot of people want them to be. Well, they never have been. And you're sitting here going, I don't have, like, at the end of the day, I don't want to see anything, violent happen, but I don't have a reference to be like, this is why this is happening and this is why I believe it. I'm just kind of like, the situation will get taken care of without my opinion.
Well, sometimes we have to ask, well, why is it happening? When you look at, first Gulf War, right? Great example. You got Kuwait and you got Iraq. Well, why did Iraq invade Kuwait? You can go back and look at that and see that. Well, first off, those countries are young countries themselves. They were originally British territories. When the Brits created Iraq and created a bunch of these countries, they didn't exactly do a good job of creating national borders. And some of that was by design to create perpetual conflict because it keeps them weak. But historically, Kuwait was always part of Iraq. It was a province. It was separated when the British moved it around, carved it out. And there was, slant well drilling, a bunch of other things happening, a lot of antagonization. The Iraqis didn't feel that it was actually really separated. And then, of course, we had an ambassador who said, well, we really wouldn't, get involved if you just walked across the border. Of course, we did. But, there's reasons why that conflict happened the way it did. And it's the same with, with Ukraine. It's the same with, Kosovo and what happened in the Balkans and all those different things.
I mean, the most famous of them all is Israel and Palestine. I mean, it's
always an argument. Yeah, you talk about Palestine and why it's so bad. Well, nobody talks about the fact that the Arab nations have really screwed the Palestinians and done nothing to help those people at all. Where's their land concession to help them? There's big swaths of Jordan were part of Palestine, but nobody talks about that.
Yeah.
The Jordanians were just happy as hell to let Israelis have it because it was one less headache for them to deal with. But at the same time, they've done nothing to help the situation.
Yeah.
They didn't carve out portions of their land to give them a free country, or Lebanon or Syria. Why not? Why is Egypt not giving part of the Sinai to the Palestinians? Because they don't want to.
The conflict is just condensed into one tiny little area.
Looks like with Ukraine, it's horrible that Russia's invaded, and they should not have invaded. There really was a pathway to make this not happen the way it did. But the question goes back to, why did they invade? Why did they feel the need to invade? Why does NATO feel the need to accept every country in Europe all the way up to Russia's border? Well, if NATO, what is the purpose of NATO? Its purpose was originally for the Soviet Union after World War II.
Yep.
Well, that went away. Well, why did we keep it? And why did we expand it? And if it's a defensive organization and Russia is not the reason why we have it, why in God's name do we not welcome Russia into it and bring them into the whole architecture to begin with? I mean, Turkey and Greece, that's like having Russia inside NATO. Turkey and Greece hate each other's guts. They've historically fought each other for thousands of years. But what do? We cleverly brought them together and put them in an alliance where they can't fight each other. Solve the problem. I mean, there's border issues and problems, things like that, but they haven't had a war between each other.
Yeah.
Because part of alliance, they can't. And there's a process now for them to negotiate and deal with these processes and settle the disputes before they become a conflict.
Yeah. And you're sitting here going, like, you get this false sense of danger into a degree, because you see, just look at a map. Russia's freaking huge.
They're huge.
It's massive, but guess what? 90% of it is uninhabitable. It's like, it's empty. It's 100% empty. You're sitting here going, like Canada. Everybody lives by the southern border. Why? Because the rest is uninhabitable. It's like it's big, it's this, it's that. The U.S. is the size of the Sahara Desert, theoretically. And you're like, but the Sahara Desert is wholly uninhabitable unless you're around the coast or in the southern where it gets more temperate.
Look at how many people live in the United States east of the Mississippi versus west.
Oh yeah, when you look at those, so we just had our midterms, in November, and when they dotted the voting and like the density of like the voting areas, and it was like red versus blue, but not Democrat versus Republican, just density versus not. Yeah. The density, they said, like, what is it, like 70 to 80% of all voters are just the coasts, and you're like sitting here going, but you have a bunch of land in the middle, but you realize the density and the population density, it's not what it seems. Mm-hmm. And Russia's the same way. I mean, St. Petersburg, Moscow, it's all in one portion of Russia. And it also just happens to be the east or the western part. But you're like sitting here going, I don't want to put my foot in my mouth and say something stupid about it, but it's like there's ways to just kind of sit back and take a breath and go, okay, yes, they're huge, but you have to understand what else isn't there, which is basically...
and because it's so geographically close.
Yes.
When we brought the Baltics into NATO, like right now, we have a lot of forces in the Baltics to bolster that border up and deter Russia from maybe thinking of going over there. When I don't think the Russians are going to actually want to invade any NATO country at all. But from their perspective, okay, take your American hat off, your Western hat off, put a Russian hat on, okay? So war game it from a red cell from that perspective. They have, upwards of 7,500 to 12,000 NATO soldiers, less than 50 miles from St. Petersburg, or less than 100 miles from St. Petersburg. How do you think they feel about that? That's pretty damn close to their second largest city.
Yeah.
Kharkiv is less than 320 miles from Moscow. That's a day's drive. That's not exactly a lot of distance. So from a perspective of an organization that's a highly defensive organization, you sure are wanting to be really close to a lot of your major industrial and population centers.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I have a author friend, Tim Heath, who's been on this show. He's born and raised, Brit Englishman, but he lives in Estonia,
mhm.
and I think he lived in St. Petersburg. I know he lived in Russia for a number of years, but he lived in St. Petersburg, I believe, for a number of years. And I, I'll say this objective, I honestly wasn't sure where Estonia was. Like I knew that it was like in that area, but I'm like, is it part of the like Western European? Is it Eastern European? Like I wasn't sure just because I know the name mostly because of Encino Man. But sorry, it's just the movie guy.
No, I know. I'm sure you're
He's
talking
from
about.
Estonia. It's just because he's. But so of course I have this big map behind me, and I spin around, and I look at Estonia, and I see where he specifically lives, the city that he's in, and then I'm like, holy crap, St. Petersburg is right there, and I'm like, I just
Right.
didn't know, and I'm like, oh, that brings it into a completely different perspective because his main series is in takes place in Russia, and it's in St. Petersburg, Moscow. Like it's about the Russian president. And it's about like not Putin, but the Russian president, and like a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. And I'm just like completely understand, mind blown, eyes opened. Like I get it, and I'm just like, holy cow.
It sucks because right now we've been in this perpetual state of hostilities with Russia from the Cold War all the way forward. We never welcomed them into the West when the Soviet Union fell and kind of tried to integrate them in. And we say we did, but what did we really try to do? We just tried to replace their government with a more friendly Western government was our way.
Yeah, we tried to take them over basically,
It's more or less, but
more or less.
it's frustrating because we could have brought them into the fold and integrated them in better and had them there as an ally with us. Because the fact is, the real 21st century adversary we're going to be really dealing with right now is China.
Yeah,
That's it. They are the way their country operates and set up and run. It's become. I mean, it's a communist country, but it's become more of like a techno-communist in a way. They're able to do things we can't, like build a road, do certain things because they don't have to do an environmental impact study that's going to take 10 years to finish to figure out how many bugs are going to get killed or what kind of endangered animal is going to get impacted by this road. They just build the damn thing and they go right through and they get their things done. And
yeah,
they're able to rapidly scale and build their whole society. I mean, look at just where they were 40 years ago to where they are now. They have brought hundreds of millions of people from farms into cities and built up a technological society that's going to eclipse us.
yeah,
Their young people are learning STEM in the sciences and going into these hard fields at young ages very rapidly. And what are we doing? We're doing gender studies and pronouns.
yeah.
We're not focused on the things that are going to actually propel us to go forward. And these countries they're building generations of young people that are going to do all of that. They're going to lead and make that go. And they have big territorial ambitions. They have big ambitions to, just as the U.S. uses the petrodollar and the Fed to basically economically control a lot of things in the world, they're trying to do the same things with their Silk Road and their, the digital Silk Road and the physical Silk Road, where they're going in and building a port for a country, and they own 51% of it. They build you a port, and then they're able to connect that port to their factories and bring in their stuff. And then they build a railroad from that port to all the major cities. Again, they own 51% of all the infrastructure. And they're building all these things out, and they're connecting their factories to all these countries. It's a very long-term view and plan, but that is going to make them an absolute powerhouse.
Yeah, and then just look recently, within the last 10 years, them opening up commerce and trade. We have movies being made there for super cheap, and they're more than happy to fund most of it. And that's why you have
Henry Kissinger said the last thing we want to do is push Russia and China together. That's why Henry Kissinger and Nixon went to China. That's why they opened it up, and we were able to we had that Sino-Soviet break, and Chinese were allied with us versus the Soviets. That was a big freaking deal. And that's what we wanted to kind of maintain, so to speak. We wanted to have where Russia and China are more of an adversarial, not a brotherly embrace because they both feel like they're getting isolated by us. That's a nightmare scenario because now you have China's industry and population with Russia's natural resources and geography. Big problem down the road. You know,
Yeah.
the problem tomorrow? No. But that's a huge problem in about 5 to 7 years from now.
Yeah.
Really, because they're building massive amounts of pipelines and infrastructure to connect eastern portions of Russia with into China to get rid of the sea lane dependency that China has for its natural resources for fuel. When that sea lane is no longer a relevant thing, that's going to be a real challenge for us to control or be able to control China.
No, yeah, and I again, your perspective is a lot different than mine because you've lived it, you've seen it, you know the behind the scenes behind a lot of this stuff, negotiation wise. I get it.
I can
It's
see where the future conflicts are going to be, and I
yeah,
don't want to anticipate it and say, okay, well, suppose they are this way. How do we prevent it? How do we better position for it? Should it have to happen?
yeah,
You know, things like that.
but yeah. So kind of next thing I just wanted to ask you about was we talked a little off the air about this, but like so when you're putting your next Monroe Doctrine or your next Rise of the Republic story together, and you kind of have the launch point from where you're like, okay, this is kind of the ground floor. This is kind of where I want it to start. This is kind of like the gray kind of plot point of the story. What does it look like from there? Like when you're really diving into the research for like the next novel, like where does it kind of blossom from there? Like what does it look like on your side of the screen?
Yeah, so I'm not a 100% pantser, and I just write by the seat of my pants. I'm also not a heavy detailed outliner either. Usually, I have a story arc, an idea in my head. I have the start point, and I have an end point, and it's a matter of how I get there.
Sure.
So with each book, I tend to write it out in like kind of like bullet points, so to speak, of what I want to actually encompass or cover in there. And then I start figuring out the chapters. Okay, so if this is what I want to cover, what are the POVs, point of views I'm going to tell it from? It tells me what characters are going to be in it, what's the timeline we're going to cover, and where's it going to go. So in like Monroe Doctrine Volume 6, we released October 31st. It was a very condensed timeline. We were covering about, I think it's 3 or 4 months of the war. Very short time frame, so to speak. And there was only a small set of characters that were also going to be involved in that. So I kind of knew where I was going. Now the next iteration, volume 7, that I'll be working on. Hopefully I get on that in about 2 or 3 weeks when I finish the sci-fi book. That one is going to be a much larger timeline. So that'll pick up in October, basically October where the last one ends. It's probably going to go through close to the summer of the next year. So we have a lot of activity that's going to happen. A lot of things are going to take place. And it's a matter of figuring out, well, what are the main events that happen and at what points do they happen and how do you get there? So we have a really unique out of the box kind of way of going after the Chinese AI, where it's located, how we're going to do that kind of attack. So I had to do a lot of research on tectonic plates. Where are some of them located? Had to do some pretty good research on like kinetic vehicles, like kinetic kill vehicles, where you're basically watching these things from orbit. So one, how do you get these? The Air Force had this cool idea back in the 80s called the rods of God kind of thing, where you had these satellites in space and throw down these big tungsten rods and use a kinetic thing hit like that. How would that work? How could you make something like that work right now? And how could you get something like that into space in a manner that the ground stations are not going to know it's there, or if they do, are not going to zap it before you can actually use it. So it's created some quite clever research to figure out how you would disguise it, how you would work that, what kind of technologies are available to make that kind of thing happen, and then do that for the scenario I want to write. So it's a cool idea how we're going to crack the egg, how we're going to get in there.
So it's essentially like the half brother of the kind of the railgun in a way, where it's like throwing projectiles versus I mean that's what a bullet is. It's just a projectile, but
They just get you dropping them from space.
and you're using just force, gravity.
Yeah, you have a it's on a nose cone or somewhere around that area. You have to have shielding and things like that. There's ways you can put in there where You can one use GPS, you can use visual recognitions, you can use all kinds of different ways to know exactly precision where it's going to go. There's other little things you can put on for steering to do minor course adjustments with little fins that can pop out, and ways to make that work. And then typically you also have like maybe a one or two stage burn rocket at the end, because when you drop it, you want to get it going. You know, it'll naturally get going, but if you give it a little oomph, you're going to get going faster, quicker, and that gets you aiming where you want it. And then as you're nearing, you know, once you've made your final course corrections and you're kind of headed in, maybe you want to give it a little extra juice. And so and when you're hitting a target, you know, Mach 15, Mach 20, you don't need actual explosives. It's just the kinetic energy that causes the damage. And if you hit it right, you're gonna go pretty darn deep. And if you can get a couple of them, you go down and then down and then down. You can crack hundreds and hundreds of feet deep.
Okay, almost like bunker buster stuff.
Well, yeah, you got a bunker down. How are you gonna get to a bunker that's 800 feet under the ground? And be clever and figure out how you're gonna crack the egg.
Yeah, you got to crack the egg, and a surface explosion just isn't going to do it. You got to get deep enough.
Like right now, we have these we have a bunker buster right now in the U.S. inventory. It's actually a nuclear bunker buster. It's a very small yield nuke. I think it's like 0.3 or something kilotons, but it gets down 50 to 100 feet under the ground and then detonates. Well, that creates a cavern. You follow another one right through after that. Goes right into the cavern you just created, and boom, you detonate another one. You can chisel your way down pretty deep. Yeah. But that's not an effective way to do this. There's got to be better ways. So I'm working on a better way to do it for this book.
Nice. Interesting. That's cool. Like creating your own tech, obviously based on tech that's in existence, or at least in
I haven't tested or had the technology to test it just yet. But it works. Theoretically, it works.
Yeah, like my stuff's different because all of my stuff revolves around some sort of event or some sort of relic in human history. So it's like, and that's where location is everything in my case, where, your conflicts are global. My conflict is usually very, very small and very, very localized. And so I rely on the locality to tell the story versus, in your case, sometimes interplanetary conflict, where it's like one whole system against another, where I guess my stories in retrospect are much tinier conflict, where it's it's man versus man or team versus team. It's not really nation versus nation in this case, because usually, at least in this case, it's more like so there's like pirates involved or something, and they're trying to steal the treasure that Jack is just trying to confirm exists. And he's just kind of caught in the crossfire and like that type of stuff. So it's like, I think that's where like me as the writer, I've never done anything or have tried to do anything as big as what you do. I guess for me, it's more of the dauntingness of the setup and just getting it going. But I guess like any other book, once you get it going, you already have the universe built and you already have kind of the conflict in the story. Just kind of
how many POVs do I put in here? Because
I can imagine.
I do too many sometimes, and I never go into it wanting to do that. But you want to tell the story of what happened in this location, and well, you had to create a character to do it. And then once you've got them there, you're like, well, what if we follow them through the rest of the conflict? Where else are they going to go? How else are they going to interact?
And that's
that.
Yeah, and that's why it's the Jack Riley adventures, is because the main point of view is Jack. He's the hero. He is the reason you're reading these books. And I try to do his I don't know what the heck that was, but my Alexa activated. That was weird. But he is the main point of view. He is, so I can condense it to where he is more or less he is driving the story. I mean, that's just the style of book that this is. But I also like to kind of relay to the reader that a lot of the information that's going on in these stories, if it's unknown to Jack, because he is the driving force behind the series, a lot of the time it's going to be it's going to be unknown to the reader too. And that's
unless I introduce it. And then if I introduce it, who introduces it and how?
exactly. And that's kind of, it's the same thing, but not, but it kind of is. So you have to introduce it because Jack isn't a know-it-all. I've never portrayed him as that. He's an ex-Delta operator who had a mission go sideways in Mosul and retired, horrible PTSD, needed to get away from all the fighting, and became a park ranger for 4 or 5 years out in Yellowstone. And then because of his background, because of his relationships, got kind of brought into this, what I've named the Tactical Archaeological Command. And it's within the U.S. military, and it's this clandestine operation that is designed to investigate, confirm, and if necessary, protect historically valuable assets. And, so whether it's treasure, whether it's a lost city, whether it's a lost people, it's just something that needs to be protected from being pillaged and pirated and that kind of stuff, or just ultimately destroyed. And the soldier within him understands that and believes in it because he was, he's always believed,
sheepdog,
yeah, and God and country, and he's just, he understands protecting people's lives, and that if no one else is going to do it, I might as well do it, type of thing. And so his point of view drives everything, and he's just he's a history buff. He knows a lot military history, and like a lot of, he's kind of like me, where if it interests him, he'll go the extra mile to read about it and kind of understand it and research it. But if he doesn't know about it, he's also not afraid to just say, I don't know what the hell's going on. He's just like, whatever. I see something. But he's not going to overly, tell the story because he's not the narrator of it all. He's just kind of in the moment. So getting kind of deeper into this like storytelling, I guess specifically with Rise of the Republic, because it takes place on a world that you're creating versus a world that you're more familiar with than ours. Yeah, and you're more ingrained with and that you live on. The evolution of kind of building, because like your society, your ancient society, that's something that you've had to create from the ground up, and kind of their customs and their language and their this and their that. And I'm just kind of fascinated in stuff like that.
Societies are now having to create, from scratch.
Yeah. I can only imagine I guess it's not really I guess it's kind of like the outline of it all, because that information is something that you have to transplant from book to book for accuracy, obviously, and storytelling and continuity.
The big challenge we ran into was in this series was the first time we actually had to really create this kind of thing, was coming up with a series Bible, so to speak.
Yeah.
All that data. And that Bible right now is 68 pages. I mean, it's not small. It's a lot of crap.
Jeez.
And it's only going to expand and get bigger as we continue to develop out the spin-off series of the main. So, for the longest time, we did not introduce like the alien POV. Like, it was always our human and some of our, and even when we introduced some of our other alien that we interacted with, we were never in their POVs. It was always us, our POV, interacting with them. In book 6 is when we did the first introduction of our main alien adversaries POV. So gotcha. In that book, probably 30, maybe even 40% of it was actually told from their perspective.
Gotcha.
Wildly different, completely changed the story. And that book was real heavy actually on like space espionage almost. It really was. It was a very different approach. And now as I go into book 7 and onward in the rest of the series, we're going to start to have some of these alien POVs kind of being brought in and told a little bit. So it does add more layers to the story. It expands. It gives you new avenues. It's just different ways of being able to tell it. But you got to tell it in a way that people still find fascinating, people still find interesting. Because otherwise they're not... Financially, you're not going to be able to continue writing if you're not making money to, one, pay for editing, pay for covers, pay for advertising, and still pay yourself a salary.
Sure.
Today it's a business. You've got to be able to do all of those functions, or you're just not going to survive. And people got, you got to convince people, you got to write a good story, or they're not going to pay money to buy your book. And one of our, we're not a 99-cent writer. We don't sell our books for 99 cents because, again, this is a business. I support my family with this, and I produce a quality work, and I want to give a reader a quality work. That means I've got to earn a certain amount of money from the books in order to do that.
Sure.
And I think people are more than willing to pay they're more willing to pay a higher price for a good product.
Sure.
You know, at the same point, I recognize that there are always going to be readers who are, financially constrained. You got people who just devour books all the time. Well, my books are in Kindle Unlimited for that reader, for that purpose.
Same.
But price wise, I'm not going to degrade my work down to a lower price. Why? They're in Kindle Unlimited. That's covered. This is to be able to support my family and continue to produce the quality works they want. People want these stories. They want this kind of story. They need to be willing to pay a little more to get it, so we can survive to write them.
Yeah.
We have to make a living at this, or you're not going to have good stories and good written books. I mean, maybe people will just want to have an AI written book and they don't care about that stuff. But I don't think we're there yet. And
it's probably going to happen sooner or later, but we're not.
Find a way of being able to delineate that, hey, this book was written by AI, and that's why this author's spitting out like 5 books a day or something like that.
Sure.
It's not really possible.
Yeah.
But I mean, at the end of the day, you've got to be able to earn a living in this field and be able to do that. And we've done a good job on that. But I work a ridiculous amount of hours to make that happen, and I probably spend easy 20 hours a week or more just in marketing, just going through the data side of things on Amazon's advertising platforms and like really deep into that stuff. And it works. I mean, but at the same time, it's not easy. I self-teach myself this stuff, and I'm always learning, and I'm spending a lot of money on this stuff to make it work. But I have to, it's a business. I got to grow it. I got to continue to build it and kind of do that, because I want to be here doing this 10, 15 years from now.
Yeah, no, I 100% understand. And I'm doing the publishing thing with Nick, with Conundrum. I'm doing 2 different podcasts. I'm writing full time. I got family to take care of.
You got to do it every time. I mean, you look at this way. I always tell people, like, how do you do all this stuff? It's simple. You got 24 hours in a day, okay? So divide up your time.
Yeah.
You need, how many hours of sleep do you need? Do you need 4 hours? Do you need 5? Do you need 8? Figure out what you need. Get what you need. In my case, say I probably get about 5 hours of sleep a day, give or take, maybe 6 if I'm lucky. So let's say I get 6. That gives me 18 hours of the day. My commute is from my bed to my lazy boy chair, which is 10 feet. Okay, it's not very far. So if I have 18 hours, say I allocate 2 hours in the morning with the munchkins before they go off to school, I'm down to 16 hours of work are available. I allocate, say, 3 hours in the evening to spend with them between dinner and bedtime. Okay, so now I'm down to 13 hours. Maybe another 2 hours for like personal F-off time or whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
Well, I'm down to 11 hours. Well, I have 11 times 7. That's 77 hours. Was that 77? I don't know. I've got 11 hours a day, 7 days a week to spend on writing, doing your business. Okay?
Yeah.
That's a lot. Now, people will say, well, don't you take any time off or whatever? Yes, you do take time off. There's time where you're not going to do any work at all that day, or you're not going to write anything. And you're going to have other days where you just work like an animal. It all balances out. But you have to prioritize. What do you want to do? Where do you want to be? I'm working like an animal right now, but I'm not going to be doing this for 10 years. I'm building a business. I'm building a portfolio. I'm getting the infrastructure and everything built up. And it just means that there's a lot of work that has to be done, because I can only write a good quality book so fast.
Yeah.
For me to write 120,000 word book, 130,000 word book, that takes about 7 to 8 weeks to do it right, with research and writing, and that's actually kind of quick at that kind of a length. And then it goes through about a month and a half of editing. Now my wife and my editor handle that, and I'm on to the next book. And it's a machine like that, and that allows me to push out between 4 and 5 books comfortably a year. Last year was hell. That sucked. I did 6 books last year. I can't do that the second year. I was just doing that.
Yeah.
I got stuck behind some deadlines I had to meet, and just had to do it. So, you got to figure out sustainability. I mean, I don't have 100 books behind my belt, and I don't want 100 books. I'd rather be producing 4 or 5 really good books a year than producing a book a week or a book a month. Because I've proven, and as have several other authors, I'm friends with A.G. Riddle, and Jerry's proven it. Nail 7 figures on just 1 book a year. There's a handful. And Doug Richards, same thing. And I've got some of my writer friends who consistently do these really big numbers that are 7 figures or high 6 figures on 1 and 2 books a year, or even 3 books. You can do that. You don't have to do the book a week or the book a month. You got to create a quality book at a right price that the reader will pay to grow your business, and then find the audience that's going to buy it.
Yeah, I mean, I've done that's where the Arcane archaeological thrillers that Nick and I are doing together was birthed, is because
Now we could spend hours talking like the business side of writing for like
oh
writers.
yeah, oh yeah,
Learn how to do this kind of stuff. I can spend hours teaching that kind of stuff because
yeah.
we've done it. I mean, we've had multiple years where we've had, pretty good mid upper 6 figures on that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not easy. It's not easy.
No.
But it's possible if you build the right plan and you really get good at understanding data, how to market, how to leverage the platforms right. And that you're going to spend as much time on that sometimes as you will writing. And people don't always equate that. And you got to live like a pauper. I mean, we were making really good money with the writing, but we never paid ourselves very much. We paid ourselves very little. And we plowed everything into marketing, just everything to professionalizing it. Getting, I spend, it's about 2 cents a word is what I usually pay for my editing. Okay, so it's a little on the higher side. But I have a really good quality editor, and she edits very quick, and she's able to work with my psycho crazy schedule. And so, but we spend a lot on editing, and we spend, editing, good covers, all that stuff. It's to create a good quality work that you're going to charge $8 for an ebook. You got to put some effort into it and some money, and then you got to market it. Marketing's expensive, man. I mean,
marketing is. Yeah, and for some people, because of just understanding it, it's a black hole. I mean, I know so many people that market and it does nothing for them because they're just like, they don't understand it or they don't research it.
They're not spending the time educating themselves. I didn't know so much about marketing, and there's so much I still don't know. But you know what? I spend 5-10 hours or whatever a week on YouTube learning about it, watching videos, talking with people, just testing it. Sometimes it's like taking $1,000 and just accepting that I'm going to burn this $1,000 running a bunch of tests on marketing to see what works.
Yeah, and that was
how to refine it and make it better.
Yeah, that's the attractor for me with Nick, who I've known for a while, is his background is very much involved in that, and he understands the machine that is online advertising, and I really don't, and it's kind of been very helpful to know him and work with him because he's very like heady with this kind of stuff and I'm not, and kind of being able to bounce ideas off each other, coming more from the realist in myself, just being the novice of it all, and then him having the experience of it all and going, well, what if we do this? Will this work? Just thinking of just like a normal realistic way approach.
He's like,
and then he'll bounce back, or he'll go, hey, I really haven't thought about that, because he's so beyond, people are sometimes so beyond the like ground level of, I guess, idea. Yeah, and you miss things, exactly. And we've really kind of, figured out.
Balance each other out.
Yeah, we balance each other out great when it comes to that, because I am more than willing to do all this stuff. I like the media stuff. I like kind of this kind of stuff. I like hosting things like this. This is very natural for me, very easy for me. Probably because I was in sales for most of my adult life, so I'm very used to just talking to people and just conversations. But he is very much in love with a lot of like the behind the scenes stuff, the marketing, the publishing, like all that kind of stuff. And I'm just kind of along for the ride now, helping him run Conundrum, because signing a ton of authors. We got a lot of great stuff coming out this year. 2023 is going to be really, really ridiculous for us. All of my stuff is now being published through Conundrum, minus my Jack Riley series, which is signed through Severed Press. That's just contracts. But it's kind of one of those things where I'm learning a lot of the marketing and advertising kind of on the fly while I'm doing this, and I'm beginning to understand it more. And luckily I have a partner that is already there, and we're not like bashing our heads against the wall together. It's just me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, the crash course is definitely in effect. Luckily, I've been doing this long enough that I understand the logistics of it all. But like, I understand what sells just from trial and error. And, it's not the best way to do it. But I get that
Works.
I am an action adventure author. I write historical thrillers, action adventure stuff that revolves around history. I love it. It's what sells the best for me. So I just continue to do it. And now I have to figure out other things to write within that genre that don't butt up against other stories. So that's actually the most challenging thing for me right now is I'm going to be having, so my goal is 4 books a year. I'm going to be having 3 different series within the same genre, but 3 completely different storytellers. And that's where Zara Kane came into play with Nick, is him and I always wanted to work together, and we liked the idea of writing this style of book together. And that's how I got involved with Conundrum, is because I started writing this book with him, and then he got so overwhelmed with everything, he asked me to come on board. So here we are. And it was stories that didn't work within the Jack Riley series just because of his personality and his background that worked perfectly for Zara, because I was able to build that character fresh and then introduce these stories that didn't work for Jack, just trying to outline them for Jack and go, this just doesn't feel right for a, quote, Jack Riley book. This feels different. And I'm like, well, why don't I just write something different? So that's where Zara came into play. And now it's her stories. So now the 30 or 40 different book titles and like little sentence plot point outlines and stuff for this is what it's going to be about, I just copied and pasted those over into a different file with Zara because they just didn't feel right for a Jack book. Zara is more over the top. She's bigger. She's grander. She's more speculative. She's more like what if, whereas Jack is very grounded and very like more like straight laced with like the story itself, even though I do get pretty big and over the top, but it's a different style. I'm more willing to cross those boundaries with Zara than I am Jack, just because Jack hasn't crossed those boundaries yet, and it just didn't feel right. So the next series, and then I have a new series I'm starting up called Relics of God, and it's going to be wholly based on biblical artifacts. And that's just my love of Indiana Jones and wanting to tell these stories and go, but the way I want to tell them doesn't fit Jack, because I want to go more into like the supernatural stuff. I want to go into more of the like belief systems. I want to go into like things like that, but it didn't feel like a Jack story. So, but it didn't feel like a Zara story either. So I'm sitting here going, all right, I guess we're just creating another universe, and we're just, anything that was like biblical related, I pulled off and put in a third file, which is now going to be called Relics of God. And it's going to be a new set of heroes, a new, brother and sister duo that are kind of driving that series. But what I love is that it's all within the world that I love in history, but it's different levels of intensity and different levels of how willing I am to cross that boundary.
And it's finding the time to write it all. It's like,
yeah, that's the thing. And that's where schedule. So Jack Riley books,
I just don't have time to write them all.
Jack Riley books sell great. If it was my choice, I would just write them all back to back to back to back. The problem is I would like this series to last more than 3 years. And it's like, because of just, I don't want to run out of Jack. I don't want to run out of those stories. And,
Here's one avenue you can do. I don't know if you like this approach or not. This is kind of what I'm probably going to do with sci-fi, because you're right and want to write for a while.
Sure.
So I have my main series, right? And inside the main series, however, though, I'm designing it and building where I'm going to have like spin-off series. And when that main series is done, that's when I'm actually going to go in and fill in some of these spin-off series that I wove into the main one. Okay. So right now, like in book 6 and then in book 7 here, I'm bringing like the 101st Airborne Division is now going to go into space, bring the Screaming Eagles forward, and they're now going to become the 101st Orbital Assault Division, and they're basically, so the paratroopers are now shock troops to go down and hit the, establish the beachhead and expand it out. So then the conventional army comes in and brings in all the heavy ordnance to, conquer. So what I'm doing is like, in book 6, we wrote in parts of, parts of the 506, Easy Company and the whole former Band of Brothers piece comes in there. And then in book 7, now we're bringing in the 327th, the Bastogne Bulldogs, and bringing them in. And, but what's going to happen is there's going to be a full separate spin-off story. That's the entire division. that we're going to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to sit on the 327th, and we're going to follow some of the soldiers in that unit that I'm talking about in the main one. So when the main series is done, well, now I'm going to go back and I'll write that spin-off series with them that I introduced in the main series, got my readers' appetite wet for it. So if they want to see they want to see this story arc from a different point of view, from a whole nother unit, this is how they're going to do it.
Yeah, and this is my first attempt at a proper universe build too. So it's Jack with TAC, with the Tactical Archaeological Command, and then when I started writing Zara, so the biggest thing with these like historical romps and these action adventure thrillers is like Indy had a purpose to do a lot of this stuff. He was a historical nut. He loved this stuff, but he also worked for the college and he did a lot of work for the museum. And so I'm sitting here going, well, how does my character get from point A to point B in a realistic fashion other than just jet setting around the world on his own dime? Well, we've already established that Jack isn't a billionaire philanthropist playboy like Tony Stark. You know, he doesn't have the dime, or he doesn't really want the dime. He just enjoys the adventure. Sure. You know, and he likes the job. He doesn't care about the money. He doesn't really care about the treasure and the fortune. He just likes the experience of it all. And so I created a fictional organization within the U.S. military with funding coming in from the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. I created the chairman, my own guy, who's aware of this. You know, very select people know that TAC exists and that there's funding going to them to kind of, because there's a
the black budget, man, is a portion of the Pentagon budget that just nobody knows where it goes.
Yeah, you know, what is the famous line from Independence Day? You don't really think they're spending $40,000 on a toothbrush, $30,000 on a toilet seat, you know? So it's like, no, but so that's where it's like, it's feasible and it's believable for the average reader to see an organization like this being funded by our government, because we know what's being spent and we know that a lot of it doesn't make sense. So whatever, you know, it's never been a thought. It's just, let's do it. And Zara was the same problem. Is it's like, how do I get her around the globe to where it makes sense? And that's where I like the uber realistic approach of it. Was, well, I've already built this universe with TAC, and I have Solomon Rager, who is a former Army general who died of cancer, who really did have cancer, and he really was on his deathbed, but he had no family to speak of. And when he recovered, he was approached by some of the commanders and said, well, would you want a chance at starting your life over and being in command of an entire covert organization? And he jumped at the opportunity. So he is declared dead. And now he is kind of my Nick Fury character, where he is kind of overseeing this organization, which is now 10 years old, give or take. Jack joins recently. So I built a little bit of historical background with this organization, and he is still outfitting it. He is still building it. He is still bringing in people he trusts, because he's had agents go rogue. He's had a lot of, So I'm like, well, what if Rager shows up like Fury did for a while at the end of these movies, recruiting a team of specialists? And I'm like, Zara could just be a part of TAC. And I'm like, but she has a different expertise. She was born in Brooklyn. She was born in New York. Her mother dies when she's young. Her father gets a teaching job. He's an actual archaeologist and teacher, and he gets a job at Cambridge to teach. It moves his son and daughter to England, and she grows up and she's got a fascination with languages, and she was speaking multiple languages very young, and she becomes an army intelligence linguist for the British Army. And she does that for about a decade. And then when she gets out, she starts working for the British Museum and is a archaeologist, historian. Yeah. And now one event leads to another in the first book of the series, in the Anubis Plague. British Museum gets not utterly destroyed, but pretty destroyed. And she's out of the job. She doesn't have really anything going on. She doesn't know what to do now. And then the events get the attention of TAC. And they are more than happy to ask her services. And so now I have another agent, not necessarily meaning that Jack and Zara are going to be partners, but they're just parts of the same universe working for this organization, and they all kind of have their specialties. Where Jack's U.S. based, Zara is going to be European based. And they kind of have like, well, what is Jack really good at? If it's World War II oriented, usually that's kind of a Jack thing because his grandfather, who he grew up with, was in the British Army, and he was a historian of U.S. or of world military, or just military history in general. And I'm like, okay, so Jack kind of has his thing that he's good at. Zara has her thing that she's good at. And then I'm kind of like building this little universe together, but I'm going to have B characters cross back and forth. So I have mention of Jack and Zara in some other series, but they don't know each other. So it's just kind of like that dropping of, little dropping of things for my readers to go, oh, cool, Jack, oh, cool. Just kind of reminding them that they are a part of the same world. And maybe there is a way that these two will cross paths in a crossover one day. But, but these are, like I said, it's just a way for me to tell the stories that I want to tell and trying to think of a clever way to do it. And, the sales have said I've done the right thing, but, hey, but that's kind of where we are now. And it's kind of a way for me to kind of just, like I said, build these universes from the ground up, kind of like what you've been doing, and figure out a way to make it work. So, but so before we get out of here, I know we've been here for a couple hours now, but it's been awesome. I've enjoyed every second of it, James. I really do. I always like to get a recommendation from you. So a book of yours, if a reader is not familiar with your work, for them to start with and go, okay, this is a James Rosone book. Like, this is him. Like, for me, I always tell people, Forgotten Fortune, the first Jack Riley book, that is like me to a T as far as a storyteller. I love Jack in general, not just that book, but that's the first book of the series. So obviously launching point. And then a book of someone else that doesn't even have to be fictional. It could be autobiography. It could be, historical reference of just something that influenced you as a writer, or just something that you just enjoyed the hell out of. So first, a book of yours. Like if somebody really wants to know you as the author, what should they read?
Well, if you like a really good story, I would, I think our Monroe Doctrine series is by far one of our best ones. I think it's hands down our best thriller that we've ever written. Just phenomenal book, personally. That series has generated over 15,000 reviews in less than 2 years, or barely 2 years, across just the 6 of them, which is a pretty astounding thing to do. I mean, same point we said of the sci-fi one. I'm not known for sci-fi, but the 7 books in that series have already managed to generate over 16,000 reviews in just a hair over 2 years. So, I mean, for not being from that genre, we really crushed it there. It just depends on the kind of story you like. If you're more into sci-fi, if you're more into thriller. And to be honest with you, I would say our sci-fi is written pretty much like a military thriller. All we did was change, like a techno thriller. We just changed the dates and, evolved the technology forward a little bit. To be honest with you, I mean, if you're asking stylistic wise. And as far as books that I personally have enjoyed and liked a lot, one of the books is called To Risk It All. It's a nonfiction book written by retired Admiral James Stavridis. So I worked for Admiral Stavridis at U.S. European Command for most of his tenure when he was there as a NATO commander. He was fascinating guy to listen to when I saw him in person there, and he'd stop by and talk with some of us the entire time. Very intellectual man, very smart guy. And what I really enjoyed about that particular book was he looked at very significant points in his case in naval history of where leaders had to make wildly unpopular decisions at times because it was the right decision at that moment, but it was maybe the wrong decision in hindsight sometimes. Or sometimes you find yourself in a situation and you just have to make it a decision nobody's going to like. And one example I found was like in the Pueblo, I think it was one of the naval ships got captured by the North Koreans. It was in the 60s, I think it was, in there. And I'm sure I got the dates wrong. What was fascinating about, though, was the commander for the thing went through a lot of hell with the Navy over surrendering his ship. But the God's honest truth was he had no freaking choice. His ship had encountered a series of problems. There was no support for them to get on. They were taking fire. The people that were getting wounded. He had no ability to defend himself at that point. What more was he going to do? Just go down with the ship? You know,
Yeah.
very shallow water. Sure, scuttle it in 100 feet of water. Good job. They're just going to send divers down and lift it up or pull off what they need. It's not like it's going down in deep water and going to get away. You're going to be able to safeguard the secrets. It was a commander who was left in a horrible situation with no good options. And he made the best decision he could to save his people. And it goes through a whole litany of different examples like that. And I thought that was really, for me, really interesting because, sometimes life is like that. You just have to make decisions based on the information you have at hand. And sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong, and sometimes they're, nobody's going to agree with you, but you have to do it because it's right for you and your family in that moment. And that's not always popular. The right decision it's most often not the popular decision. And that's challenging. Another book is a different way of approaching it. It's more of a memoir. That one's called Breaking History. That was the one with Jared Kushner about the Middle East stuff.
Okay.
Say what you want about him and whatever your beliefs are on him or whatever. The fact is that is a serious problem in the Middle East, tough nut to crack. And they accomplished something that our foreign policy and diplomats have not been able to do for 50 odd years. You get some Arab nations to make peace with Israel and recognize the right to exist.
Mm-hmm.
That's a remarkable achievement. And they did it because he took a different approach. I was an interrogator. Okay. I spent a lot of time face to face with a serious hardcore Al-Qaeda, dredges of the earth. Okay. When you get with people like that, you've got to find ways to connect and find ways to pull information and negotiate and navigate these waters. It's not like, you're not Jack Bauer. You can't just torture people to get what you want. You have to get them to willingly give it or trick them. That's hard. And in what Kushner was talking about was when he went there and met with the people in Qatar and met with Saudis, he took a different approach. He just sat there and he listened. He wanted to hear what their perspective was. What was their angle here? What were they thinking? What did they want to see? What was their approach? Because we have always been about what our angle is, our approach, what we think. We never took into account their approach, their perspective.
Yeah.
And a different tact that he took with that, but it worked. And for me, I'm always about taking what works in every facet of industry or whatever and finding out how I can adapt it to my own life and my own business and what I'm doing and make it work for me. What can I learn?
Yeah.
How do I get better?
No, well said. That's kind of like knowing your role, staying in your lane, like your type of thing where you're using that information in a way that it's going to benefit you and it's going to benefit you to the 10th degree. And, like you said, sit back and listen and take it all in and then form the decision. Yeah. Yes, exactly. And any industry, anything you do, that's the way to do it. That's why whatever the old adage is where, I can't remember the exact adage, but it's basically, you sit back and listen and let the other guy put his foot in his mouth. And then you have all the information you need. And then you can then kind of like put the period down and like end it because you're just basically parroting what the other person has now said. But they need to hear it coming from you versus you just yelling at them. And you're never going to solve anything by doing that. So, but if the other person kind of like, well, some people, they just don't have the willingness or the ability to process because they're 100% in utterly emotion and they're not sitting back.
Put yourself in the other person's shoes.
Yeah.
It's like, as a writer, okay.
And I'm sure that's what Jared did is he heard everything and then he had an opinion and he had all the facts and then he was able to negotiate knowing what you just said. Well, you guys just said this. So look at the similarities and everything you're talking about. Look at this. This is why this can work in this because he sat back and he allowed it to happen.
Well, the thing is, he's not a politician. So he approaches this from a business perspective where it's, yes, everything is a transaction. Okay. That's politics. That's diplomacy. That's business. Mm-hmm. You want something. I want something. How do we make this work together so we both come away with what we need? It doesn't always have to be a zero-sum game. It is in many cases, but it doesn't always have to be. And when it's not zero-sum, you need to make sure everyone gets a win. Yeah. And that's a different approach that he took because he came at it from a different mindset.
Yeah, that was what Trump did with Korea. I mean, you're sitting here going,
yeah.
that just happened. And it kind of happened overnight. It was kind of like very like, boom, let's talk. Okay.
Well, but notice how we got there. We got there
Yeah.
because it was an overwhelming ratchet of escalation. He's like, well, I got nuke stuff, and Trump's like, well, I got a nuke button, and guess what? It works, and I got enough nukes to flatten your country, 100 times over, and people are just aghast. Well, because you're aghast because you're thinking like a Westerner. You're not thinking like these people, and they respect power, and they respect that. And they went, whoa, okay, this is a different tact. This guy's a little nuts. He might actually do this. And it caused them to have to reset. They didn't know how to react to him.
Yep.
And that changed things. And it opened an opportunity then to actually pursue and have a conversation.
But that's the businessman in him, where he controls the room, because it's a different mindset. It's a different approach to the job in this case.
People get so like polarized. Yeah. They can't see that. They can't accept that something could be both good and bad.
Yeah.
Maybe I learned that from my job as an interrogator, where I had to find those things and those touch points with these horrible people to be able to get my job done and do that. But when I'm writing a character, my character's got to be real. My best compliment was literally having 2 1-stars back to back. One says this is right-wing MAGA propaganda. Another one says this is left-wing, whatever. Literally, both people, absolutely polar opposites, same book.
Huh.
To me, is a sign of a great writer, because what you've done is you've written characters that are so real, so compelling, that they can trigger both sides in the same book, in the same chapters. That's brilliant. That's the way you want it. Your Russian character has to be Russian. Your German has to be German. Your American, well, depending on where they are, have to be where they're from.
Yeah, I wrote a spy thriller. It was my first, my only straightforward action assassin thriller. And I got backlash for it because it was misogynistic and it was sexual. And I'm like, kind of the point of the book is it's about human trafficking. It's about a lot of issues going on in Asia. The spy thriller genre, the way that the guy gets his job done, the way that the woman gets his job done. Yeah, that's kind of the point of the book. It's not what I believe, but it's the characters, and it's how they get the job done. And it's not a belief, it's just the realness. I made it as uber realistic as possible, and granted, it didn't sell all that well, but I think that was more of just a genre issue than it was the book, because I don't write straightforward action thrillers like that, unless it's got a massive amount of historical backbone to it, and more or less these action adventure stuff I've been talking about. But my recommendation personally is always going to be The Forgotten Fortune. Please check it out. Book 5 will be coming out, like I said, as we record this on January 12th. Book 5 will be coming out, I'd say within about the next 4 weeks is my timeline. I'd like to be mid-February. But recommendation specifically for an audience of James's is, I think I've recommended it before on this channel, but it's very, very impactful to me as a reader. And it's from Jeremy Robinson, and it's his Jack Sigler series, which features the chess team operative group. And first book, Pulse, was one of Jeremy's first books. I think it was probably the third or fourth book that I read from him. Yeah. And techno thriller, military, historical, sci-fi. The man's a master at blending genres to the point to where I get utterly lost thinking of trying to do it. Yeah. But that book was just so influential to me as a consumer, let alone a writer. And he's been working on the last book in the series for a couple of years now, and it's mostly his time, but it's also him trying to do it properly and do it right. Instead of just release something and hope it sticks. He wants it to be an impactful release, so he's taking his time with it. So more power to him.
It takes time to write a good book sometimes.
Yeah, it does. And he's very, very prolific. He writes a ton of stuff. He was releasing 7, 8, 9 books a year for a while, and it was all quality product. It was all good. Last few years has slowed down, but it's been intentional. Pulse was amazing, and I recommend it to people that just love the techno thriller military style. A lot of research into it. Very realistic with that, but he also goes deep into the mythologies, like in this case, the mythical Hydra and Hercules, is also interlaced into it, and it's just a really great book. So I really do recommend it. But like I said, I think it's something that your readers would enjoy, just knowing a little bit more of the technical side of like the military stuff as well. And he goes deeper into like tactics and research and stuff on that end too. But yeah, James, thank you so much for coming on. I really do appreciate it. For those watching and listening, please subscribe and like to the channel, both on YouTube and audio podcast form. We are available on every major audio podcast format, whether it's Apple, whether it's Google, whether it's Spotify, Stitcher, anything you can think of. We are there. We also have another podcast called Armchair Directors, where myself and Richard Padden go through our favorite movies, and we kind of take it from a writer's perspective. And if you really like long-winded tangents about something that has absolutely nothing to do with the movie we're talking about, that's a good podcast for you, because we get kind of trapped in these conversations and it's just like, what were we talking about? But yeah, exactly. It's a great podcast. It's audio only. So we don't do video for that, just because video production's semi-time consuming. So we do have that going for us. Check us out at Conundrum Publishing, conundrumpub.com. If you are an aspiring writer and you're just unsure about the marketing and publishing side of things, we will be more than willing to partner with you. We do action thrillers, mostly action adventure thrillers. We are looking for those fast-paced, just fun books, but also within all the different genres that includes, whether it's military, whether it's historical, whether it's both. A bunch of different, and if it's more like PG-13 adventure, as long as it kind of meets that criteria of action thrillers, we are more than willing to give it a look. We have a subscription page on our site. We've got a ton of stuff going on. Like I said, Venetian Pursuit for me is Jack Riley 5. That's coming out shortly. I know James has a couple of books coming out, or he's got his next Monroe Doctrine. I think that's up for a pre-order right now, right?
It is up for pre-order. That'll come out. And then we've got Into the Chair, which I think is book 8 of sci-fi. That's the one I'm literally writing right now. That's going to come out next month.
Okay, very good, very good. So yeah, we both got projects constantly. So if anybody has any questions for you, whether it's direct contact with you or whether it's just looking for your stuff, obviously Amazon is the best avenue for all of this stuff. Very
Facebook,
dense.
Twitter, on both those you can find me.
Okay. Yeah. Just because I know the reader just likes to pick our brains sometimes. And if we have time, I love to do it. And that's the reason I love doing this show specifically, is just kind of being able to chit chat and just kind of bounce things off of one another, and completely different perspectives. Sometimes it's not even the same genre of writer. So it's kind of cool to hear it all. I'm a big behind the scenes kind of guy with movies too. So I've always liked to see how it's made and how it's done, and just kind of different perspective. Right. But thank you so much for coming on, James. I really do appreciate it. Like I said, like and subscribe to the show, and we'll talk to you next time. Thank you.